Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is Verdant Flower, Crimson Wind in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 11, Act 2, The Egg Hatches. At high noon, Edelgard, accompanied by those of her personal guard who could walk and some replacements Dorothea had handpicked to replace those too wounded to attend, along with Petra, walked into the kingdom camp for the first time, with a simple goal, to get King Bladdid to agree to a plan that would revive her nation at great cost to his own. Create a new nation made entirely out of dragons he would have to share the continent with again at great cost to his own, and bind his nation to a federation comprised of Faerghus, Adrestia, and whatever Flame was going to name her new nation, meaning she was asking him to sign the kingdom onto a plan with two other nations that didn't actually exist at the moment. Simple. Goddess teeth. He was going to laugh her out of his tent. Dorothea, what were you thinking? No one else shared Edelgard's inner turmoil save Petra, who was with her, and even as worried and nervous as Edelgard was, that was a comfort, to have her with her in the flesh. The Brigid woman quirked an eyebrow at Edelgard, plainly seeing her concern, but Edelgard just shook her head gently. In this area, Petra couldn't help her. She'd missed a childhood of royal learning, too. After all, they had only had each other for all their youth, and anything Petra knew about government she knew because her and Edelgard had helped each other learn. Even as kids, Edelgard had a dream that, one day, she could see Petra back on her throne in Brigid, make up for all that was done to her people by restoring her crown to her. Bereft of adult teachers, they'd been forced to teach each other, devouring book after book. What education they'd received had, very conspicuously, not included politics, probably at Duke Agir's request. They had tried to cut her legs out from under her even as a child, in hopes of a puppet emperor. In ways, she owed Claude. His assault meant the plans of the nobility had been for naught, hard to puppet a nation that was dead. She'd make him pay. In time. In time she would finish the work she had begun at Garag Mach. She would kill him, and make him pay for all the debt of the last 5 years. Still, for all the grimness of her thoughts, she and Petra were alone in their gloominess. Everyone else was in high spirits, and the general mood was genial. Faerghus soldiers milled about, the blue and white everywhere, the armor and tents all completely uniform, which was a little weird for Edelgard. Well, they've had a functional country to produce equipment with, Edelgard thought to herself. They didn't have to steal most of their tents and supplies. The benefits of having a home to defend, and industries supporting the war effort, instead of being a mobile camp. She shook her head, and wiped her brow of sweat. It was getting warm, almost to a proper Adrestian temperature, and a few of the Faergi were clearly beginning to melt like ice in the heat. Still, victory in battle had already warmed up their blood and inured them to the summer heat. Their horses were gulping down water, though, as angry about the temperature as their humans should have been, too unaware of victories to be comforted by them. Faergi waved, or tried to chat them up, wondering what this pack of Adrestians was doing in their midst. Many of them ended up recognizing her. She supposed she cut a distinctive figure, between the eye patch and being barely over 5 foot in height. It was hard to disguise herself as anyone but who she was. What was more surprising were the ones who recognized Petra, cheerfully waving at her, something she returned in equal measure. The questions of the Faergi floated around them. Edelgard caught snatches of it as they walked through the long rows of blue tents and stables, surrounded by the sounds of the vast kingdom grand army. That's Edelgard. Last emperor of Adrestia. I told you the eagles were real. I owe you 10, fair and square, Julienne. Damn glad they were here for us. Saved our lives. We could have taken M. But sure made it easier to have the eagles with us. I had a cousin, I heard he'd joined them. Wonder if he's actually with them or he just ran off with that merchant girl. So that's the Phoenix, huh? Phoenix? Yeah, 'cause she's gonna resurrect Adrestia. The Phoenix. Swat, I heard some mage call her. She's like, super short. King Dimitri could pick her up and use her as a weapon. Timothy, what the hell? I've heard she's as strong as she is tiny, though, more likely she'd pick Dimitri up and use him as a weapon. I'd give the 10 I just won back to see that. Edelgard smirked at the mental image. She did intend on wielding Dimitri, but in a financial sense, not physical. She needed his money more than his might. Not that both weren't welcome. The Great Bridge of Murden was the hardest target in Fodlan, save perhaps the locket itself. Dorothea would come up with something, though. They'd talked a little of it, before she'd sent Edelgard on. Edelgard might be the Emperor, but Dorothea was the boss. It took time for a messenger to find them. Edelgard wasn't surprised. Technically they weren't an official delegation, so they didn't bear the Adrestian flag with them, one of Dorothea's ideas. If this looked less formal, Edelgard would have an easier time playing on Dimitri's emotions. Dorothea wanted it to come off like Edelgard had just wanted to come see him. Edelgard didn't much like the subterfuge. There was a reason Edelgard's favored weapons were axes and fire. She was powerful and passionate, not subtle. Perhaps in other circumstances, she would have been, but some part of her thinks that, even in other lives, she would have been more force than finesse. She couldn't imagine pulling off something like the Stormcaller thing Claude tried. She'd probably have called herself something like the Hidden Emperor or something, or maybe referenced her fiery magic. She never had been any good at naming things. Yet another reason Dorothea should have been making this plea, not her. What did Edelgard know of diplomacy? The Adrestian red on their armor, and the black eagles on every chest plate, were enough to get a messenger coming along. Sadly, it wasn't the Duskirian who'd reminded Annette so much of Gareg Mach's old gatekeeper, an event she'd told them about. No, it was a tall Faergi woman of imposing stature. Edelgard wondered where that man had ended up, and wished him well, wherever he had went. Such a chipper man, though Edelgard never had caught the guy's name. Emperor Edelgard, came the messenger's greeting, all business. She stood ramrod straight. Dame Maria, at your service. Might I assist you? I need to see Dimitri. King Bladdid, Edelgard said, wincing over the misstep. The messenger made no visible reaction, too professional to do so. She instead bowed. Please stay here, I will see if the king is receiving visitors, she said, and then she was gone, leaving them to stand around, Edelgard feeling suddenly very watched and very nervous. People waved, people shouted, the eagles were a spectacle, and Edelgard realized this was the biggest group of non-eagles she'd seen in 5 years. But they all seemed happy to see her, to see them, and that was good, right? Good, it was good, even though it didn't make Edelgard any less nervous, didn't keep sweat from running under the heavy leather of her eye patch and poking at the wounded wreck that had once been her eye. Her hands felt cold and clammy, and she only hoped that she wouldn't drop the folder she'd taken with her as a primer, her leather gloves feeling loose around her hands. No wonder she'd dove into the ashes for all these years, it was so much simpler than all this worry. Goddess, she hoped she didn't crack. She couldn't retreat, not now, even if all of her nerves were burning her up, not even if the temptation was there, nice and cooling. Hey, came Petra's voice, quiet, cutting through her fears as the Brigid princess shifted to stand next to the Adrestian princess. Are you okay? Nobody ever asks that of someone who is, Edelgard said softly, unconsciously shifting to press closer to her best friend. I wish I had more time to prepare. But Dorothea, she was insistent it be today. Wonder why, Petra said, frowning. She must have a reason. Edelgard shrugged. I'm sure she does, but I can't parse it out. Wished she'd kissed me less and explained more. Petra smirked. I must say, I didn't expect to find you so subordinate. Admittedly, you never did know what to do with Dorothea, but she always knew how to handle you. That provoked a laugh out of Edelgard, nervous as she was. Quite a way to put it. They stood in silence then, Edelgard just taking comfort from the presence of family, until the messenger came back. King Bleadid is willing to meet with you, she said. Follow me. Adeljadra followed, and her mind churned, wondering if anyone would ever know about this, in the future, when history books were written about these days. She was an Adrestian, after all, whose legacy reached back to Fodlan's beginning. History was part and parcel of her blood. Adelgard's history longer than anyone's, it went back the farthest, to Nemesis in history. And today, it's on me to make sure it goes forward into the future, Edelgard thought, and felt the weight of that sentence settle across her back. It wasn't so heavy. She had carried all Brigid on her shoulders since childhood, all the atrocity inflicted on her family and that innocent people both. This burden was not so heavy, not so terrible. She pondered the possible books of the future as she walked. It would depend on if they won or not. If the alliance's counterattack should succeed, this meeting would be dismissed by future writers, an ultimately unimportant act of the eventual losers. Should the alliance fall, though, maybe a fancy tapestry would display this moment. Or maybe it would get forgotten. Historians tended towards drama, and peaceful talks with an ally tended to fail that test. Maybe Cethline being here will make it more dramatic, Edelgard thought. The first treaty in centuries between the firstborn and the children, yes, that sounded more to historians' tastes. She might even get an urn. And I shouldn't discount myself or the Eagles, either. The last emperor of Adrestia, leading a legendary rebellion, well, I was present while Dorothea led it, anyway, and Petra, the ghost of Brigid, alive again and present. Yeah, she might get an urn, but only if this worked. Goddess in Byleth, she prayed aloud, quietly, whispering it to herself, keep me from fucking this up. Even amidst her sorrow and despair, Suthies could not help but burble a quick laugh at the sheer honesty of that swift prayer. Petra heard it and chuckled, but said nothing else. Too quickly they were before the great tent. Too quickly was the moment upon her. Edelgard's breath threatened to quicken, and she had to remind herself to calm down. They weren't going to immediately begin negotiating. There'd be talk first, the dialogue equivalent of foreplay. She fought down a blush, remembering Dorothea and her tent and that terribly comfy bed beast the songstress slept on. What a day, first kisses, and now diplomatic meetings and small talk, the first time Edelgard had represented her country as emperor in far too long. Dorothea had done all this work beforehand, with Edelgard a figurehead to provide her authority for her decisions. Moving from figurehead to captain of the ship was a tall order, even with Dorothea's hand secretly on the wheel. Edelgard hoped she was up to it, and even as she entered the tent sparing a bow to the Dusker guards she was dreading the small talk that was going to precede her offer. The number of genuine conversations Edelgard had with other people in the last half-decade could be counted on both hands, and half of those had taken place over the last week, ever since she saw Byleth at Garregmach and the shock forced her awake. They were all with her Eagles, who'd known her before, when she was unhurt. Damn it, the language was so clumsy for this, that'd be half the work once she got a hospital for the mind set up. They needed words for it, a language for healers and layfolk alike. What was she supposed to talk about? The weather? Or would that be offensive, since it was summer and everyone knew Feyrgi melted like ice in any temperatures above freezing? Ask him how his marriage was? She didn't know if he'd adopted any kids, or, well, anything, really. She'd have preferred a battle. She understood that. As her eye adjusted to the tent's relative darkness, she saw that her and Petra were alone with Dmitri. Well, his guards were there, but for royalty, that was practically being alone. Not as many guards as there had been, either just those who were still alive. The Dragon Knights squad had not been as lax as the rest of the Alliance forces. But why were they so lax? Alliance troops are better disciplined than that, usually, she wondered, before dismissing the thought. Focus, Edelgard. Remember Dorothea said I didn't have to convince him here, just get him started thinking on it. Dorothea had a plan to come at his retainer later, and she's going to have Flane preach to the Feyrgi to get popular support going. This isn't all on your head. This is just the first time of a multi-pronged plan to get them all to agree. Just do your part. Greetings, Emperor Edelgard. Dmitri said. He looked much like he had as a teenager, just bigger, better featured. More settled, as though he had grown into himself. A great spray of fur topped a cloak that lay behind him on his chair's back. He was dressed simply enough, in blue and white tunic and pants of high quality. Royal elegance, simply stated, and not a burden on martial action, the very picture of a Feyrgi warrior king. Edelgard wondered what she looked like, in his eyes. He made Edelgard feel rather underdressed, but then again, that might just be her own nerves talking. Wonder if he thinks I'd make a good weapon, she thought, remembering the soldiers' conversation, and she almost giggled out of sheer nervousness. Her guards filed in behind her as she walked up to the table. Though she didn't sit down, wasn't proper to sit until he offered her a seat, she remembered that lesson from her younger readings. Greetings, King Dmitri, she said, and then some thorny honesty inside, propelled by her internal distress at this meeting, provoked her into saying, it feels weird, to say that. It feels weird to hear it, Dmitri said, tone more subdued. Even now. Feels weird to say Emperor Edelgard, too, but mostly because I thought you were dead. I was close, Edelgard admitted. Her body had walked and talked and fought, but Edelgard had not been there for most of the last 5 years. Dmitri nodded and offered her a seat with a broad wave of his hand. He was taking her words in a different way than she'd meant. He just assumed she was talking of the danger of her rebel guerrilla lifestyle. Please, sit. I believe we have a meeting to attend, Dmitri said, then motioned for his guards to leave. You may leave, I trust Edelgard. The same to you, Edelgard told her bodyguards, who left more reluctantly. Petra paused, looking at her, and Edelgard nodded. Dorothea had been adamant they be alone for as much of this as possible. The two royals were both silent as the soldiers filtered out, Petra remaining by Edelgard's side until the last moment. While they were leaving, the thought flickered through Edelgard's head of the one successful attempt at diplomacy she'd ever made, entering Byleth to join the Black Eagles. I did that by being very honest and very blunt, she thought to herself. Maybe I'll just do that again. If I try to lie or dress the truth up any, I'll trip myself up. Just be honest. Petra, once the last guard was out, finally left, squeezing her shoulder before leaving with one last backwards glance as she stepped outside, reluctant to leave her again after such a short time reunited. But at last, they were alone. For a long minute, they just sat there, the two royals alone, and it didn't feel like two nations meeting here. It felt like Gareg Mach, like Edelgard and Dmitri across the aisle at lunch, as they sat at the round table. She wondered what he was thinking. Finally, Dmitri flashed her a smile, bright as sunlight on snow. It's good to see you alive, sister. Edelgard's breath caught in her throat. She'd almost forgotten about that part in her worry over everything else. Dmitri clearly hadn't, but then again, she'd shouted it at him across a battlefield, it would be hard to miss. So you heard that, she said, mouth a bit dry. Smoking coffin, this couldn't possibly be the way Dorothea intended her to begin this conversation. Hard not to, Dmitri chided gently. Very dramatic, to yell it across a battlefield. I wasn't aware that you had ever thought about our accidental, erstwhile connection. I do, and often, Edelgard admitted, wavering inside. The ashes were right there. But, he had greeted her with sister. Clearly he didn't think it was inappropriate. Do you mind? She asked. We're siblings, so I don't see how it could be, he said gently. Though I'm surprised you never seemed to remember it while we were at Gareg Mach, yet you cared enough. It was the first thing you yelled to me when my life was in danger. Dmitri had learned to pay attention in the last 5 years. Edelgard closed her eye and nodded, and she thought maybe that should be the end of it, but there was so much to say about it, and she'd told herself to be blunt and honest. Forgive me, Dorothea, Edelgard thought, before she opened her mouth. I am what I am. I always wanted to call you brother, Edelgard admitted. But I didn't. It is a thin connection. You know what happened to my family, well, everyone does. The curse of being an emperor, even my most personal tragedies are public. And, it always comforted me to think I had at least one sibling left, that my entire family wasn't dead, even if the lone survivor was a stepbrother hundreds of miles away. She had never told anyone that, except Petra. Dmitri's eyes widened in surprise at her confession. Edelgard was glad she had the folder in her hands, otherwise they wouldn't know what to do with themselves, but even as it was, she clenched the papers tight, knuckles white. But then we were at Gareg Mach, and to tell you that the mere idea of you had comforted me at my lowest points. I had no idea how to broach that subject with you, she admitted. I didn't even know you. How could I say, hey, do you know how important you are to me? Did you know the idea of you being my brother kept me stable? There is no easy or good way to approach that conversation. Not even now. Edelgard paused, and glanced away. I had no idea you felt that way, he said softly. She shrugged. You had no reason to know. It's fine. No, he said. But I only wish I could have been there for you in more than spirit and thought. I had no idea it mattered to you this much. Edelgard shrugged. Like I said, I had no idea how to even approach the subject. You could hardly be blamed for your ignorance. I'd be glad to call you sister, he said. You've saved me twice, once at Garreg Mach from that bastard Claude, and now here at Gronder from his minion. Calling you sister seems a fair trade. You've saved me, too, she said. Not just from Seath, but by merely being here you've saved me. Fair Gus distracts less Easter, and so the eagles have been safe in your shadow. If they were to fully commit, they'd kill us. Same to you, Dmitri said. The eagles and all your exploits are the stuff of legends, and it relieves pressure on the kingdom. We've been saving each other for a long time, I think. She smiled. I guess so. I'm just sorry I cost you an eye, he said. But, well, you lost more than an eye at Garreg Mach, and while I have no eyes to gift you, I do have a chance to return one of those other things you lost at the monastery. She said, as he rose up, and from behind himself opened a long wooden case. Did you found it by accident while we were fleeing the first assault of the Stormcaller's troops, he said. I've kept it repaired, originally it was located at your gravestone. Gravestone? Edelgard said, confused. I had a graveyard made for you and the other eagles, Dmitri said quietly, as he withdrew something from the box. It's located in Verdant. My way of remembering the brave heroes who fought Claude before anyone did. We had a ceremony for each of you. I felt, after everything, that there should be a memory of you, who had fought abomination before any of us knew it was even in our midst. He turned around. And here you are now, still fighting, so have a gift, to make the next fight easier. With a smile, he held up a weapon Edelgard had never thought to see again, and she gasped. Amber. There it was, one of the great dragonbone weapons of the past, the weapon she had lost along with her eye fighting at the monastery, so long ago. I thought you might like it, Dmitri said, smiling as he walked around the table and handed it to her. She put her folder down on the table and rose up to take it in her hands, feel the weight of it again. I had it removed from the shrine in case we'd need it. I pulled out all the stops for the Kingdom Grand Army. I apologize for desecrating your grave like that. I choose to forgive you for it, because I'm still alive, Edelgard said, and both chuckled as she marveled at the weight and feel of her old axe, back in her hands. Goddess in Byleth, I've missed this thing. Glad to help, Dmitri said, as he returned to his end of the table. Albeit what's this business of the goddess being in Byleth? Oh. Dmitri didn't know about any of that. About Ciro's, Solin's experiments, Byleth, Suthi's. Shit. I am not going to get into it, Edelgard said. That's something Flane is better equipped to explain, and we need to focus on the real reason I asked for this meeting, though I'll admit, part of me did just want to see you, brother. That word sent a happy feeling through her, warm and welcome. I will allow Flane to tell me, then, he said, then shook his head. Just one quick question first. I've been hearing rumors, but until I saw the dragons working for you, I didn't believe them, but now, well. I feel I must ask. Is Flane really Saint Cethline? Yes, Edelgard said. She is. I don't know how to deal with that, Dmitri admitted. It seems so impossible. I knew her. Flane was just a really good, heavily scarred girl I knew, sweet and kind, liked fish. To think of her as Saint Cethline, she sure doesn't resemble her portrait much, though they got her dragon form right. She's pretty annoyed about that, Edelgard said, smiling. She doesn't know why they make her out to be an older woman. She was as old as you see her when she helped Nemesis, a teenager as her people record things. She cooked for me a few times, at Garreg Mach, Dmitri said, laughing in disbelief. Most excellent fish dishes, and she never went heavy on the spice like you Adrestians do. Made meals you could eat without your mouth and your ass both burning afterwards. And I thought her sea green hair had to mean something, but I never guessed that she was Saint Cethline, that. I almost fear my life has been taken over by a writer of chivalric romances, but the writer has no editor and a hankering for the dramatic. His grin was infectious. Edelgard smiled too, even as she kept glancing at Amber, finally back in her hands after all this time. She'd thought Claude had it. So, Dmitri said. What did you come to discuss? Nerves threatened to overwhelm her again at the reminder of her real task, but Petra was returned to her, Amr was back in her hand, Dmitri let her call him brother, and what use was worry, at this point? I am blunt, and honest, Edelgard told herself, as she leaned Amr against the table, gentle with her vicious weapon, and screwed her courage to the sticking place. A thing she missed about herself, she was brave, too. I'm about to make you the worst offer of your life, she said to Dmitri. She paused to let him respond, and the silence dragged on for a long minute. That's quite an opener, he said. I'm not gifted at diplomacy, she said. And I don't like lying. So I'm simply going to lay it out like it is. I'm listening, Dmitri said, and Edelgard slid her folder across the table to him. What's this? He asked, as he opened it to the first page, and looked down at the 3 words written there. The Griffin Federation, Edelgard said, echoing the words written there. A plan for after the war. A way to win the war and the peace both. A plan to revive Adrestia and grant the tribe of Sethline land of its own, a place for her Nabatea to live with us in peace, the way they did before Suthes died and Siros tried to strangle humanity. A federation, to rule all Fodlan, each nation to have a voice in international politics, so something like this never happens again, and we can rebuild. Dmitri read that word, and looked down under it, at the flag silver griffin on black background, under a sea-green star. Why a griffin? He asked. Those aren't common anywhere but Morphais. A lion and an eagle, Edelgard said with a shrug. Seemed appropriate. The stars for Flane's people. Okay, he said. That doesn't sound like the worst offer I've ever heard. You haven't flipped the page, Edelgard said dryly. Dmitri, I'll be blunt with you. This will be terribly expensive for Faergus. You'll be doing most of the heavy lifting, economically, Adrestia's too devastated to contribute much at first, and Sethline's tribe doesn't exactly have a lot of gold either. I'm sure I'm supposed to dress it up, or lie to you about that fact, but I'd rather be honest. I'm better at it. This deal will demand a lot of the kingdom and not give much back until much later. We're already stretched thin by the war, Dmitri said, as he turned the page and began scanning the proposal. Where do you propose these funds come from? A big chunk of it will be from Leicester, Edelgard said. I think it's fair they pay for the harm they've caused, once this is done. But the rest is just going to be little things. Kingdom merchants not scalping Adrestia in its time of weakness. Kingdom experts to teach Adrestians arts and knowledge we've lost in the occupation. The kingdom not robbing Adrestia blind in the process of helping reclaim it. No single major thing, save the war funds from Leicester, just a lot of little things. None of which will make me popular, Dmitri said. Merchants will be salivating to sell goods expensively to your people, no soldier likes hearing they can't go looting, and I'm assuming you won't be able to pay the kingdom experts very well, given your general lack of funds. Nope, Edelgard said. In fact, I imagine it will make you terribly unpopular for a while. You can probably coast by on being the king who won the war, but it'll be a lot dicier than if you just let things play out without restraint. Okay, Dmitri said, closing the proposal and looking Edelgard in the eye. You've told me a whole list of reasons why I shouldn't agree. Now, why should I? I could tell you about the benefits for Faergus down the line, Edelgard said, benefits of stable trading partners, lack of war on the continent, unity in the face of foreign invasion from Dada or Almira, but we both know the future's uncertain. We're talking about winning the war, but we don't know if we can. Nothing says Rhea won't come down here and tear all of our heads off, that Claude won't have some scheme that renders us all dead as doornails. We might not even be able to take the Dem Bridge. So I'll give you the only real reason you should do it. I'm listening, he said. It's the right thing to do, Edelgard said, and shrugged. We both know it's the honorable thing to do. Faergus should help Adrestia and Sethline's tribe. It should help Adrestia because we were the innocent victim of the invasion, and it should help Sethline because it is the Holy Kingdom. There's no reason besides that I can offer. That's not much, to move a nation, her brother said, softly, not unkindly. Maybe not other nations, Edelgard said. But you're Faergus. I think honor is the only thing that might move you at all. Something strange moved in Dmitri's eyes at that, a surprised kind of consideration. "I'll have to think it over," he said. "You wouldn't be a king if you didn't," she said. "I'm going to return to my own camp, but—" "Dmitri." He said, still thinking, still with that strange look in his eyes. "Thank you," she said. "For Amber, and for letting me call you kin. If I agree or not, we will still be siblings," he said. "Take care, sister. You too, brother." Edelgard emerged from his tent, and felt that she'd done as well as she could have. Even emperors could not ask for more than that. And in the little tent, Dmitri kept turning the pages, flipping the idea over and over in his mind like a coin. Ferdinand moved through the camp, paying little attention, his mind stuffed with revelation. What a set of days it had been. Battle at Gronder Field, once more. He'd had so much déjà vu. On this field where the Eagles had once participated in mock battle, they now fought a real war. Memories mixed oddly in the meat of his skull. He'd led a charge then, too, but instead of corpses, he'd produced only bruises. They'd laughed it off afterwards. He'd eaten alongside the very troops whose positions he'd been charging. A feast they'd held, afterwards, and he still remembered the fun of it all, the thrill of victory undimmed by loss of any kind. Even the kingdom troops, who'd lost first, had been amused at getting so thoroughly thrashed. Dmitri apologetic to his friends even as Sylvain mocked him and Mercedes reassured him. It was so clear in his head. The table, the food, he'd sat next to Hubert and Byleth, and the Alliance had sat next to them, friends back then, not the bitter foes they would become. Claude had blushed as Byleth complimented him for his tactics, the Alliance proving a hard nut to crack, and Hilda had been smug and amused she'd taken down Petra and Hubert both when they approached her position. The Goneril woman is hard to conquer as one of the mountains in her home territory. It had taken Edelgard, Caspar, and Raphael all three to take her down. An entire flock of eagles had been needed to beat the biggest doe into submission, and she'd still taken Raphael down with her. Those memories had clashed, and badly, with the reality of what lay before him now. The dissonance nearly made him puke. Memories of feasting tables mixed with the stink of corpses and death-released shit, the laughter of his old classmates mixed with the screaming of the wounded and dying. White clouds dripping red blood. It seemed impossible that he could have been that young boy, whom he vaguely remembers, as if it was a life someone else had lived. When he had been a nobleman in truth and not an exile on the run, when he'd been cheerful and dramatic, a silly sort of kid. A fop, if not in the traditional sense, and one that, at least, had been, not a bad person, just kind of annoying. So much had changed. He walked amongst his own troops, the cavalry of the Eagles, a mishmash just like all the rest of the rebel force. Feyrgi made up a slim majority, the knight-obsessed culture producing the finest horsemen on the continent, but dowdy Imperials and howling Srang barbarians were the next two major groups, all under Ferdinand's command, the swift blade to complement the heavy infantry hammer. Even the horses were a mixed bag. Heavy Adrestian war horses, slow and huge, were stabled next to slender Leicester chargers that looked juvenile next to their giant cousins. The Feyrgus bred beasts a happy medium in between, not as slow as one, not as weak as the other. Why, they even had a few of the Morphean breeds, with their odd faces, bulging eyes, and impossible speed, horses who seemed determined to make up for their bizarre faces with equally bizarre speed and toughness. He'd heard it said that the horses had magic in their blood, that the mages of Morpheus had woven greatness into their veins, something like Edelgard's sacred crest. Ferdinand didn't know about that, but he did know he liked the Morphean breeds. His own horse was one of those strange-looking equines, one he had named Chamomile after its gentle temperament, Good Horse. He'd went through a lot of good horses, in service to his emperor. Who, right now, was trying to convince Dmitri to spend an exorbitant amount of money to save Adrestia. Goddess in Byleth, Ferdinand prayed, and that was an odd feeling. How long had it been since he had prayed? Please, help my emperor. Help Edie. She needs it. After a moment, considering his own turmoil, he finished with, help me, too. To Byleth and Suthies, Ferdinand's prayers felt like coals, dead a long time, but wanting to relight. There was still heat there, the fire had not gone completely cold. Not just yet. He hated to pray for himself, after so long not praying at all, but he couldn't help it. The news he'd received was like a match in his hands. he tried to hold it, but it burned him. He walked, aimless, just wandering the eagle's camp, as though some part of him thought maybe he'd find an answer if he just walked long enough. His father had died better than he had lived. His father, so many fights, so many arguments, but the opposite of how it should go. A father should admonish his son not to do evil, a son should never have to admonish his father to do good. Ferdinand had grown sick of fighting with his own father on clear-cut matters of honor and justice. He had grown used to the sound of his father's contempt, and met it with his own contempt in turn. He had come to the understanding that his father was a bad man, and that was the simplest and the most complicated truth he'd ever known, simultaneously. Gareg Mach had been a sweet reprieve from the constant fighting, and serving Edelgard against the Stormcaller had been even better. It had been something good, something pure, and simple and good. The Stormcaller was a monster, and they fought him in defense of holiness. He hadn't expected that, but he had welcomed it, all the same. Just like he'd not expected Edelgard, he'd thought to find a rival in Edelgard, and instead found a humble, self-effacing girl, one who had impressed him terribly. He had seen her kindnesses towards Bernie and the others, the way she would help anyone, the way she never seemed to notice her own greatness. She'd told him he was great, and never taken the word for herself, and in doing so, she'd bowled him over, and won his loyalty. Instead of a rival, he'd found an emperor worth following, and a friend. Edelgard had been the world's shortest sun, and they had revolved around her, happy to be planets in her orbit, to share in her glory and her passion to do the right thing. Then the mask had fallen off Claude's face and the scales had fallen off Ferdinand's eyes, and the next 5 years had happened. Deprivation and want and the enemy, trampling all over his people, again and again and again. And now this. His father, whom he had been so disappointed in, had died a hero of Adrestia. He had died noble and true. Ferdinand didn't know what to do with that. Not really. But he felt like he should do something, but, what? Did he forgive him? His father had not been a good man. Did his ending make up for it? Why had he done it? Had he done it to be good, or just out of spite? What had motivated the greatness of his last acts? Did he think of me, before the end? Some part of Ferdinand wondered, the part that would always be the man's son, first and foremost. He rubbed the great mane of hair he'd ended up with. He hadn't even bothered cutting it all these years, a fact he felt vaguely chagrined about, now that he was awake. The last 5 years, it almost didn't seem real. Nowhere was that unreality more apparent than when he looked around himself again, and found his wandering feet had crossed into the cavalry archers' part of the camp. It was near his own, since he ran the heavy cavalry, and horses of all kinds had similar needs, save the straying horses, which needed meat for some goddess-forsaken reason. They had to stable those by themselves or they'd try to eat the others. Cannibal horses. What a fucking thing to deal with. But the unreal part wasn't the horses, it was Bernadetta. She was reading over a list of requirements and talking with Casper, a smile on her face, and how strange that was. He remembered Bernadetta, how she had been before all this, the girl so hurt and shy that Edelgard had taken meals to her and sat quietly outside her door. It had been a thing almost too sweet to see. He remembered commiserating with Lawrence over how noble he found the whole affair, how telling it was of Edelgard's true character, no matter how she might dispute it. Lawrence, goddess, Lawrence. He was going to have to kill him. Lawrence had been one of his best friends and he was going to have to kill him. Goddess damn the golden deer, and goddess damn Ferdinand himself, for the terrible regret he felt at what he'd have to do. That same girl. Fearless Bear now, he'd heard her called. Fearless Bear, who rode into danger, who never flinched, he should know, he'd fought alongside her for 5 years. There was no cavalry charge she would not commit to, no fight so desperate that Bernadetta von Varley, now just Bernadetta, would not charge in. Where angels feared to tread, Bernie charged in, and from the jaws of defeat, tugged loose victory. Like Casper, that was why they hung out, the blue-haired berserker and the shy archer, sharing in a mutual love of violence and combat. A person could change in an instant, and a span of 5 years had many such instants inside of it. From the shy, stuttering, scared girl had emerged, like a butterfly from a chrysalis, this powerful, quiet woman. He wondered if she knew his father had once thought she'd make Ferdinand a good wife. His father had tried to arrange that marriage, and would have succeeded, save that Ferdinand had heard such rumors of her that he'd begged and pleaded until his father agreed to drop the matter. His father had hated Varley, anyway, so when his son told him that his daughter was supposed to be a monster, making curse dolls in private, his father had dropped the matter. Why had he agreed? Had he truly agreed only because he hated Varley, or because he loved his son, and wanted him to be happy? He had agreed with Ferdinand in so little while alive, but he'd died a hero. Why? He'd have expected his father to turn traitor, not to be good. He didn't understand, not why his father had relented before, and not why his father had died so well. He didn't understand. She noticed him a moment later, he'd been staring. She flinched when she caught him looking. Ferdy. Oh hey, she said, a bit nervous. What are you staring at me for? Okay, not everything had changed. Ferdinand sighed and averted his gaze. Caspar turned and gave him an eyebrow. Sorry, Bernadetta, he said. I was thinking, and didn't realize I was staring. My apologies, and to you too, Caspar. I was thinking. She shrugged. It's okay, she said, recovering faster than she ever would have in her younger days. Awkward still, but things had changed for her in the last 5 years. What's on your mind? Bernie, come on, Caspar said, giving her a look. You know what he's thinking about. Petra's news, remember? Oh, she squeaked. Sorry, Ferdy. I didn't mean to pry at you. Ferdy. Dorothea's nicknames were like a benevolent plague, infecting all her friends. It's fine, he said, waving off her concern. I apologize, I'll leave. He left, still trapped in his own thoughts, and did not see Bernadetta watch him go, with sympathetic eyes. Dorothea sat in her tent, reading reports on the goods they'd taken from the Leicester supply train, and Raphael stood next to her, holding the reports she hadn't read yet. As she finished the current report and put it to the side, he broke his silence as he handed her the next one. So I'm gonna ask a question, boss, Raphael said. Go for it, Dorothea said. Why didn't you prepare Edie better? Dimitri's gonna laugh her out of his tent, he said. Dorothea grinned. No he won't, she said. I have a plan. Blackmail. Raphael said, and Dorothea laughed. No, she said. Nothing so complicated. Dimitri's a Feyrgi. Feyrgi love honesty and bluntness, and they expect Adrestians to talk. Edie's gonna walk in there, feeling awkward, and she's going to be honest with him. She's going to be blunt. Her passion and her nature mean she'll come off as the soul of honesty to him. He also owes her his life twice over, she's his sister, and the Eagles just dramatically saved his army. Feyrgi love that kind of thing, it smacks of all their stories of their own origins. If anything could convince them to agree, that'll do it. And since Feyrgi hate going back on their agreements, if he agrees, then we win, they'll hold to it. Feyrgus doesn't break deals. If I'd prepared her, she'd come off as lying, he'd have sensed the artifice. Sending her in unprepared was vital. You sound exceptionally confident it'll work, Raphael said, and Dorothea gave him a smug grin. I know my Edie better than anyone, she said. I came up with it once I realized she was truly back. And I know Feyrgi well, too. I was actually looking at them for husbands, back at Garreg Mach, before the Stormcaller and everything. I was going to pick Sylvain, he could have Felix on the side and me as his wife. Sylvain? Raphael said. He was always better than he acted, Dorothea said, and anything further was interrupted as the guard at the door poked his head inside. Lady Edelgard, he said, and Lady Petra wished to enter. The Adrestian pondered for a moment. What is the appropriate address for her? I don't think anyone told me, he said. Call her Lady Petra, Raphael said. She's royalty too. Unless she says otherwise. Got ya, the guard said. Anyway, they wanna see you, Lady Dorothea. Show them in, Dorothea said. The duo entered a moment later. Well, I made a mess of it, Edelgard said, handing the axe in her hands to Petra before flinging herself face first onto the lumpy mattress beast in the corner, emotionally exhausted. She spoke up, face down in what had, once, been a Leicester officer's favorite pillow. Hopefully Dmitri finds the mess amusing enough that he signs it. Oh, I think you did better than you think, Dorothea said, as Raphael was distracted by the weapon in Petra's hands. Hey, is that Amber? Dmitri looked over the papers again. He'd have to have Felix go through them actually, he wanted Ash and Dida to go over them as well. Felix could figure out the political ramifications, Ash and Dida could go through the financial papers, see if the prices suggested were too skinflint, and adjust them to make sure Fergus wasn't being ripped off. Ash would also know what Fergus had and didn't have, and he'd better talk with Sylvain, too. He had a good head for politics, somewhat despite himself, and his advice might be valuable. Dmitri noticed some wording that was ambiguous, and wrote it down in a small journal he'd had a guard fetch. Notes and annotations already filled that journal, he'd get Felix to work on a second draft, with the language they'd prefer inside of it. He had secretaries, they could get something typed up fairly quickly. That was still weird to think about, 5 years into the war, that Felix not only had secretaries, but used them. But for all the work they'd do to modify this, and make it fairer to Fergus, one thing didn't change. Dmitri intended to sign it. He could not rightfully claim credit for the victory at Gronder they'd won, no matter that he'd still take that credit, if for no other reason than to boost the morale of his men. It had been the best of luck that Edelgard had been there, that the Black Eagles had pit themselves to the cause of the Blue Lions, and saved them. But this, he could claim credit for this. This was something he could choose, and it would be on him, for good or ill, but that wasn't really why he'd do it. For all the counsel he would take of his friends in making this decision, in doing it the way it should be done, it was Ingrid, unbending, honorable Ingrid, who he would take after the most. Ingrid, who held to the highest tenets of chivalry, no matter what, who had been a guidepost for Dmitri for 5 years. He had never told her, but when he was lost, he asked himself what she would do, and tried to follow through. Not always, he was not made of the same stuff as Ingrid, because nobody was. Ingrid was made of something greater than steel, stronger than stone, harder than the ice of the glaciers that dominated the great mountains. He had seen her wounds, they would have killed anyone else, but Ingrid treated them as annoyances. And Ingrid, in his position, would have signed this paper. A stupid decision. No question. Felix was going to tell him as much, he was sure. It would be expensive, to offer these goods to Adrestia, and the only reward would be some semblance of market value and Adrestian goodwill, an ephemeral thing that would fade quickly. There were benefits, but Edelgard was right, they were far off and depended on many factors. But it was the right thing to do, and what else was honor, but doing the right thing? Fergus committed so many stupidities, in the name of honor. Fathers abandoned their families in disgrace, soldiers died as they were commanded to, following their leaders, right or wrong. People killed themselves for honor, or killed others for it. So, why not do something grand for once? If honor demanded so much foolishness of them, why not do something foolish and magnificent? Why not rebuild a nation, all for the sake of honor? So many people died for honor, it would be nice to make something for it, instead, it would be nice for something to owe its life to honor and not its death. It seemed the honorable thing to do, Edelgard had been right. Adrestia had not caused this suffering, and did not deserve what happened to it. Cethline and her people did not deserve the harm done to them, either. He should restore them both. Who cared that it would be expensive? Who cared that Fergus was positioned to take the entire continent, or at least, to hem in the alliance at the bridge and steal Adrestia's already stolen land for themselves? Thieves of thieves, they could do it, but it wouldn't be honorable, and what was Fergus without its honor? Honor, that drove Fergus soldiers to die in battles they could retreat from, honor, that now demanded justice for Adrestia. Much harm does Fergus' conception of honor do its people, but few things are wrong always, few things have no virtue whatsoever, and to everything, there is a season. Dmitri, who knew not what future historians would call him, who would hear himself called the good king in his own lifetime, flipped the notebook back to the first page, looked down at the flag of the Federation, and smiled, looking at this new thing he was going to help make. Chapter 12, Interlude 3, of Knights and Eagles. Sikal woke up an hour later in great pain. His throat was sore, aching, and there was something in his lungs. Even as he awoke he was turning, spitting, water and something not quite vomit flowing out of his insides. He drew in a hacking breath between each desperate expulsion, forcing air into his lungs. He reached up to use a hand he no longer had, before the pain at his wrist's end, forgotten in his desperate need for air, reminded him of the truth. He felt lighter, and after a moment, as his head cleared, he realized why. He had no armor. His underclothes were gone, too. He was in a simple pair of pants and a white shirt, which he'd definitely not had on him before he fell in the river. "You know, I have to say, I almost let you drown." The voice pulled him up out of his own actions and into the world. He was in a tent, red cloth, decorated with a really badly painted eagle. In black, of course. Black eagles. He was sick of that goddamn symbol, after 5 years seeing it on every human building he passed, on the armor of every human he killed, on the insides of helmets of secret traitors, the pictograph sketch of a prayer. He had been on a small cot, his nose vaguely registered the scent of vulneraries and antiseptics. His stump had been bandaged and cleaned, though it still looked rather nasty. What had the Feyrgi king coated his spear in? Some kind of poison? Still, I suppose you're more useful alive than dead, so congratulations, you're in the land of the living. For now. He turned his head, his mind identifying the speaker his ears were hearing, but unable to believe it. "Man," he coughed again, spluttering for a second before resuming. "Manuela. You do remember me," his once peer drawled sarcastically. "I'm flattered." She stood before him, looming over him, which was odd to see, given he was taller than her, but everybody's taller than a man trying not to puke his guts out. She looked almost exactly the same as she used to. No, on closer inspection, that was wrong. The differences were small, smaller than they usually were for humans after a half-decade, but there, and in more than her stern, angry expression. Her eyes were sharper, clearer, not so fuzzy, not so sad. He hadn't cared much for his human peers while infiltrating the monastery, but he'd still paid attention to them, and the sorrow in Manuela was a song they both knew by heart. But he didn't see that in her now. Hard eyes, looking at him with pursed lips and a deep frown. Her body was firmer, slimmer. More muscular, more defined, less fat on her bones, though her new clothes made that harder to notice than her old clothes would have. Her outfit was no longer the loose outfit made to entice the wealthy, but soldier's gear, a practical brigandine overpants, all in dark Adrestian blacks, highlighted gently with red and of course, with the fucking eagle symbol on them, the spread wings of the empire that was. A sword at her side, drawn, and the lightest glimmers of magic in her left hand, said she knew well how dangerous he was, and stood ready to fight. He didn't feel much like fighting. Not after. "I'm going to die and I've done it all wrong." He sighed. "Why am I not dead?" he asked. "If you're asking why you didn't drown, it's because one of my rebels pulled you out of the river," Manuela said. "Monica was out fishing, and suddenly there was a tug on her line, and there you were, hooked like a fish. She had no idea who you were, just someone she pulled out of the river. Your uniform doesn't have any less Easter or Ciro's markings, after all, just big, grim blackness. She thought you might be an Adrestian, given our colors." Huh. That seemed surprisingly improbable. The grim dragon haunting him, pulling Monica's hook just a little farther out, letting it hook on Sikal's clothes. Not yet, he didn't get to die just yet. Sikal grunted as the stump on his arm suddenly throbbed with pain. "Mother's teeth." He rephrased his question. "Why have you kept me alive?" Manuela nodded. "Well, executing you was my first instinct, but I thought I'd question you first. Standard procedure." He nodded. He knew how this went. And he just couldn't work up the will to care. "So," he said. "What do you want to know?" Manuela raised an eyebrow and cocked her head to the side. Well, that's a bit more helpful than I expected. No ranting about my human failings, no villainous diatribes, no theatrical taunts. Or at least stony silence." He shook his head. Fine, I don't care anymore." The river, the water washing over him, going to die, and, what was he going to tell his creator, when he reached her? His pain didn't justify this, his life flashed before his eyes and he cannot justify it anymore, even to himself. Wish you'd decided that 5 years ago, Manuela snarked. First, what were you doing in the airmid? You looked half dead. Drowning, he responded. Hilarious, the rebel leader deadpanned, but Sikal kept talking. I had fallen from the great bridge, he said, then trailed off. What was he going to say? Speak of Laurent's betrayal, obviously, but the Gloucester lord had never been a deft poisoner. Even when he'd killed his father, he'd just stabbed the man, from what Sikal had heard, and admittedly he paid little attention to the world around him. All that poison meant Claude, probably, he'd always favored it. Apparently the deer were going to betray Cyros, or perhaps Claude had some greater plan in mind, though Sikal could not see how losing the bridge was anything but a catastrophe for Leicester and its draconic mistress. But all that speculation felt like, so much effort, right now. Everyone on the bridge is dead, he said. He'd stick with the truth. Simpler. Easier. Poison. Laurent's poisoned everyone on the bridge. All the Leicester forces are dead. He wasn't sure why he was telling her this. She was the enemy, and was going to kill him when this was done, but, did it even matter? He had done wrong, an understanding that was not sharp inside him but dull, like a weight pressing down on his chest. He had thought his last thoughts, what he had thought were his last thoughts, and they were full of sorrow and regret. In his last moments he had come clean with himself and admitted he had done wrong. He knew he had done wrong, and that realization had pierced the veil of rage and grief and mother-damned stupidity that had clouded his thoughts for long centuries. And there was nothing to do with that information, with that revelation. Even if he somehow fought his way out of this camp, what in the world could atone for sins like this? Even grueling death would not, but, well, it at least had the benefit of having an end. He could not imagine an end for atonement, he would be pushing that boulder up the hill forever and ever without end, amen. Which was a form of cowardice, but he was so tired at the moment. Lost in his own thoughts, he had missed Manuela staring at him in silence for a few long moments, disbelief on her face. You expect me to believe that Laurent's Helman Gloucester, who has lived half a decade in the service of Rhea, just believe what you want, he huffed at the human, and grimaced as his arm throbbed in pain. What other explanation do you have for my presence in the river? I fell off the bridge to try and save myself from the choking poison in the air. That's 2 days' travel from here, Manuela said. How could you be carried so far? I'm more durable than you humans are, he answered. And the Airmid is a swift river. Myrddin is empty? Manuela asked. Sikal nodded his head. Save for the corpses. Manuela shook her head, but an expression of surprise and something else, something Sikal was too tired to parse out, grew on her face anyway. Did Laurent make it off? She asked. Sikal shrugged. I was busy choking to death and then falling, I do not know. I presume he had a plan to survive, though we had cornered him, right before the poison fell. Perhaps he was trying to kill us alongside himself. She nodded, then, quieter, have you been south of the bridge? Yes, he said. Just 2 days ago, at Gronder. Gronder, she asked. What happened there? A Leicester army was devoured by the kingdom, and by Adrestian black eagles, he said, mouth twisting into a frown as he said the last few words. A stunt of Lawrence's, on review, the signs were there, but I hadn't paid attention to them. The kingdom army a vast one, something Dmitri threw together, and the Adrestian rebels fought us. Real black eagles, not your little resistance. The real, you mean the stories are true? Manuela said. We hear them, but they can't be true. Edelgard. Edelgard is most real, Sikal said. She is alive. It was while I was attempting to kill her that Dmitri hacked off my hand. Then I was forced from the field by the arrival of her fellows. Manuela paused, licked her lips. Did you see Dorothea Arnault among them? He debated being cruel for a second, before a feeling he almost didn't recognize washed over him: shame. This woman was asking after her daughter. Even as dull as he had been to the world, he had recognized the care she'd held for the girl back at Garreg Mach. He knew a parent's duties, even if he had failed them for 1,000 years. Cethline, no, put it away, Too much, too tired to think of it, of what he'd done to his little girl all these years. Of all the failed parents on the continent, he was the worst father of the bunch. Even Varley in Bear had not been so poor a parent, if only because he had not failed his duties for so long a time. "She is alive," he said. "She is alive and well. She was throwing thunderbolts at my soldiers the last I saw of her." Manuela let out a sigh, a release of pressure like steam from a teapot, worries and fears fleeing before it. "She's alive?" she asked again, just wanting to hear him say it one more time. He nodded again. "Alive and well?" A smile tugged at her lips before she reasserted herself. "I will be keeping you a few days for information. If you behave, when it's done, we'll be quick with killing you. If not, well, you still have another hand." "I understand," he said. Manuela turned around. "I've got people watching you. Don't try to escape. I'll be back." She stepped out, leaving Sikal alone to brood with his thoughts and his aching wrist. Cethleen. He had done so much wrong by her, no way to make up for it. How could anything ever be the same again? He'd pissed away all his happiness in his grief, he'd grieved too much, he'd found his wife murdered and Ciro's warcry had reverberated in his heart until there was nothing left. His wife would hate him, for what he has done, the same way his daughter must hate him. Sikal ached, and curled up on himself, his soul a stone inside him. The grim ghost gleefully spun around him, unseen, hiding in his shadow. He barely had to torment Sikal, the man tortured himself. He'd drag this out a while longer yet, it was too fun, to see him suffer. Manuela stepped out of the prisoner's tent and into her hidden camp of rebels, the northernmost roost of black eagles in all of Fodlan. It was a small thing when seen in the darkness that had just fallen, just a few simple dots of campfire lights in the late evening and early night. The fires were a risk, but not a large one. They were hidden now near the Ermid River in a gentle valley, a tiny dip in the land that hid them from prying eyes on land or in the river. By air. Well, that was what Tiki had just returned from guarding. At one end of the camp, in a cleared space, the great gangly wind dragon was landing, her wings blowing a soft breeze through the camp. She melted for a moment, reshaping into the awkward teenage form that was her human face, already reporting to Monica what she'd seen even as the rest of her was taking shape. The red-headed Adrestian woman was nodding, but not showing any reaction. Nothing much to report, then, Manuela thought. Good. A peaceful night was always a good one. She still had people standing guard shifts, of course, and Tiki would go out later after she'd eaten and slept a bit, but for now they were safe. Manuela walked to her tent, taking in a quick glance at her forces as she passed them, unconsciously checking them over the way any commander learned to do, or died, war being the school of hardest knocks. There wasn't much to look over. This was no great Adrestian axe or Faergus spear, but a less Easter arrow, a pinprick to bother the devil with. As Sikal had said, not real black eagles. She'd adopted the name from the stories they heard. Once she got her rebel band going proper, she'd originally planned to name them Dragon Slayers, but the eagle symbol worked too well. Hell, she was an Adrestian, she had a right to it. Things seemed to be in order. Archers were checking bowstrings, her small cavalry complement tending their horses, most of the rest of the camp settling down for the night and doing the little work of any camp. Her officers were doing much the same. Her two Dodden captains, the twin heads of her infantry, were in fine high spirits, Miss Akko cleaning her gauntlets as Kyoko checked out her kanabo, talking cheerfully as they ate twice their body weight in food. That was fine. They also killed twice their share of enemies, even once tag-teaming a dragon to death. They claimed to have grown up on the mean streets of some riverside city in the south before moving to Derdriu a fateful year before the invasion. Manuela couldn't imagine what a shithole it must have been, to teach the two to be so deadly. Her cavalry captain was in his tent probably still mourning the horse he'd lost last month. Manuela thought him an overdramatic sort, and coming from a former opera singer, that was saying something, but he was a good leader and able rider, when he wasn't being himself. As for her archers, she waved at the man who led them as she passed. "Lord Edmund," she said, giving him a nod. "Lady Casagranda," he replied, as formally as if they were at an evening tea. Good man. Shame about his adoptive daughter, but perhaps that had been decided long before he met the poor, frightened girl. He'd told her of Mary Ann's story. Her parents had been killed by an overzealous researcher, who feared their connection to Ceros. Maybe some part of Mary Ann had never forgotten, never forgiven. Maybe when Ceros returned, she had went to her side, in hopes of gaining revenge on a society that had cast her kin out and murdered her parents. Who knew? She slipped into her tent, which had all of her worldly possessions, mostly clothes and maps and weapons at this point. She hadn't woken up after Gareg Mach with anything but a single note, her clothes, and a single iron sword, alongside a headache. The note was burned, the clothes had long ago been shredded into bandages, the sword had since been broken on someone's armor, and the headache had faded, so she really didn't have anything left. Burned though it was, she still recalled the words on that note. "You were great, Teach. I'm sorry. Go home and be safe. Love, the Golden Deer." She'd been drugged before the great battle and moved. Apparently Claude had that much concern. She'd woken up in the Alliance in an empty house along the Ermid. Bastards could have left her with some gold, at least. She sat in her chair, and cleared her mind, to think of what Sikal had said. Dorothea was alive. My daughter is alive. The thought alone was like a sun inside her skull, and it blinded her to everything else, so she shunted it off, put it into some dark place inside her, where she could take it out after her work was done for the moment. That bright spark of happiness and hope was too much. She'd have to look at it when she had time, touch that joy when it was safe to do so. Other matters first. The bridge was open, if true, perhaps an opportunity. She had been trapped in Leicester for 5 years, partly by choice. She could do greater work here than she could in the south, but to some extent by practical matters as well. She could probably get her people across the Ermid in boats. There weren't that many of them, and the sole monarchete they had could fly, but boat crossings were slow, and Allied patrols went up and down the Ermid on just a regular enough schedule to make it risky. Her rebels were mostly Leicester folk, too, and would not have wanted to cross back into Adrestia. Many of them were at her side only because she offered some hope of kicking out the Church of Ceros, proud mountain folk who had looked at the foreign invader and her foreign religion and decided they'd go down fighting before they submitted. No, Adrestia had been closed to her for 5 long years. She couldn't go home again, just another thing she carried, like the open wound in her heart that was the question: is my daughter alive? Dorothea, if she was alive. I might get a chance to tell her I think of her as my own, instead of dancing around it like I did for years. She shut that door again, the light peeking out around the edges. No. Other matters first. Dorothea and everything else would have to wait. But thinking of Dorothea brought Manuela's mind to Gareg Mach, to that fateful year of 1180 where so much had happened, all right under her nose. Her old friend, guilt, accompanied by its drinking buddy, shame, wandered their way into her mind, the way they always did whenever she thought of her ill-fated teaching career. Other people at Gareg Mach had been fooled by the Golden Deer, but nobody had been a bigger fool than Manuela. She had literally taught the Stormcaller. She had seen the little bastard every day and never even guessed. The old thoughts resurfaced, from a door harder to keep locked than the one that kept thoughts of her daughter quiet for now. If I hadn't been so focused on getting a man, if I'd gone out drinking less, paid more attention, could I have stopped this? Are the last 5 years my fault? Did I do this? Can the goddess forgive me for not seeing the monster before my eyes? She must have been the worst professor in history. The devil himself had attended her class and she'd seen none of the details. More fool her. But those were old thoughts and old guilt and old shame, familiar as the feel of a bottle in her hand had once been. She pushed them away, with the same strength she'd found that led her to giving up alcohol, strength those very feelings had lent her. She didn't admit it to anyone, but part of the reason she'd taken up the rebel yell was because, if she hadn't, the guilt would have torn her apart. She had looked a long time at a sword she'd found in the weeks after Gareg Mach, and while she made the choice to hoist it high, for a time she had considered falling on it. Of her former class, Lawrence wouldn't be the first deer to betray Ceros. Leonie's face floated up, unbidden, the first deer to turn her face from evil. She'd found them, years ago, but instead of being at the head of a rebel hunting army she'd been alone and weaponless, her belly just beginning to show the child she carried inside her. Hell, that child had been Lawrence's, according to Leonie. She'd ridden up and asked for help, brave and brazen as you please, unafraid despite the fact Manuela had almost ordered her troops to just kill her. A deer before the very professor they'd all fooled? Manuela's rage had been nearly blinding. But Monica had begged Manuela to at least hear her out, and she'd listened to her second in command. Leonie had told her so many things, and of what she sought in the Northwest, even convinced her, despite herself, to assist. Manuela had given her food and supplies and even a checkup before sending her on her way, hoping she'd find Cethlene's old tribe, but Manuela had heard nothing from her since. Died on the road, Manuela suspected. Or found nothing and was running rebels of her own up in the Northwest. That area was too war-torn for Manuela, and too favored by Ignatz, the smartest of Claude's deer. She preferred the south and east, particularly the former House Ordelia's territory. Lawrence was smart, too, but focused on Faergus, and while Lysithea technically was lord and master over the territories Manuela roamed, her transformation had rendered her incapable of fulfilling the duties of her office. Manuela had seen her, a time or two, flying overhead with Hilda on her back on some hunt or another. The former songstress suspected, privately, that Lysithea had tried to betray Ceros too, that the brave little girl she remembered had tried to do the right thing, and paid for it by being turned forcibly into Hilda's mount. She could not otherwise explain the horror of the witch's transformation. No servant, however fanatical, would become that. If the bridge was open, and Gronder Field taken, the eagles would be coming north. Adrestian eagles, the ones the campfire stories were about, the names running through her mind like glittering jewels. Merciful Linhard, Red Raphael, her Leicester troops liked that one, for obvious reasons. Stories of the hulking barbarian warrior from their homeland, a bonfire favorite, the true emperor, who had fought this evil before anyone else even knew it was present. Wise Dorothea, whose stories Manuela could not help but listen to, even as fear for her girl overwhelmed her spirit. She should go, if Sikal's information was correct. She should at least see if his word was to be trusted. If the bridge was taken, and armies of Faergus and Adrestia coming to hold it, they'd need her. They'd need someone who knew the way to Derdriu, who knew of hidden routes and villages that were secret rebels, of mountain clans that hid drawings of great black wings under cabin floorboards. Boss, a voice from nearby, dragging her out of her head. Monica, poking her head in, the young woman who had, by dint of effort, somehow become her second in command over the heads of multiple more experienced parties. Yes. Manuela said. What did the prisoner say, boss? She asked. A lot of things, Manuela said. Do you trust any of it? If she hadn't been so focused on Dorothea, she might have thought to ponder the veracity of it all first. Still, she was used to liars from both the Middle Frank and from simply living in Inver, and this man did not seem the type. I do, she said. But let us check his most outrageous claim first. He says the Great Bridge of Murden is clear. Wait, really? Monica said. Manuela nodded. We're going to check it out, she said. Quiet and careful, but if it's true, then we may be meeting southern allies soon. We head for the Great Bridge of Murden. Monica simply shrugged. Decisions about leadership weren't her purview. She was an Adrestian like Manuela, probably half of why she'd picked her as a retainer, and where Manuela said go, all Monica had to do was figure out how they'd get there. She left, to go prepare, and Manuela, content to know that the work was going to be done, finally let herself open that little door in her head, and bask in the warmth of the thought inside. Dorothea, my daughter, is alive. A single tear ran down her cheek, tracing a smile on her lips as it passed. In the south, that same Dorothea was busily enacting her schemes. Orders went out. The kingdom was in agreement, the treaty was signed. The Griffin Federation has hatched out of its egg, no longer merely an idea in Dorothea's head, but something real. The Storm Song General could not describe her relief when the message came, alongside a copy of her document signed by Dimitri in a great looping hand. It had worked, save that it felt like a mountain had been lifted off of her back. She had bet so much on this, but the dice had landed just right. The wheel stops on her number, the dealer draws for her an ace and a 10. She'd done it. The outcast bastard daughter of a nobleman had rearranged the face of all Fodlan, and she allowed herself an exhausted laugh. For a moment she was not the great strategist and leader of Adrestia's greatest rebel army, but merely a very tired woman, resting after great deeds were done. But then she went back to work. The agreement was the peak of the mountain she was climbing, but now she had to come back down the other side, and not fall while doing so. Flags, banners, and sigils were sent out to both camps, alongside tabards and insignia patches to sew into clothing and even painted shields, all things Dorothea had ready and prepared months ahead of time. This had not been a plan of moments, after all, but something she'd been thinking about for years, only finalizing in recent days. They went everywhere, a dressy and black outlining Fairgus white and all mingled with the sea-green star of Suthies guiding the way, and soon nearly everyone amongst the camps were wearing the newborn Federation's colors alongside their own, to Dimitri's bewilderment and Felix's bemused admiration. Faergi, who liked heraldry and other accoutrements of chivalry, were eager early adopters of the symbols, particularly since Dorothea asked them to fly the flags underneath the kingdom's flag. Only over joint meetings would the griffin fly highest. The humility she displayed appealed to the Faergi's strong national pride, and soon the Kingdom Grand Army was dressed in Dorothea's choice of colors and flying her flag, all the while thinking it was their own idea. Her black eagles, ironically, were somewhat more resistant. They'd never had a standard uniform before, save the painted black wings, and it was strange to realize that one reason they never had enough seamstresses or tailors was because Dorothea had been poaching them for this specific project. They did finally put them on orders were orders, and Dorothea's orders had kept them alive years past when they should have been feeding worms, but there was grumbling. Hanzo, the cook, took to wearing his tabard as a combined mask/headband affair, to Edelgard's amusement and Dorothea's annoyance. Not that she got much of a chance to yell at him, the cooks were busy. A great commemorative feast was to be held, the soldiers to eat together, celebrating the birth of this new thing. Tensions would be high between the Faergi and the dragons in the Eagles, but Dorothea had plans in place to smooth it over, to make sure only the more cool-headed dragons brushed shoulders with the Faergi, working with Felix to ensure the more cool-headed knights among the hot-blooded northerners met the dragons, knowing that initial friendliness would spread like a benevolent plague through the kingdom camp. It wasn't like Dorothea could blame them. After all, while no prejudice was ever truly justified, it was a bit much to ask soldiers who had been fighting and dying to dragons and dragon worshippers to simply accept Nabateans into their midst. But Dorothea was determined to work on it, and Edelgard went along with her, doing as she asked. It was amazing to see Dorothea in action, Dorothea getting her audience to feel what she wanted them to feel with just a few words, the way she had back at the Middle Frank Opera. The rebel emperor of Adrestia assisted where she could, doing as Dorothea asked, and hoping it helped. But even as the troops eat, drink and make merry, plans were in place to continue the war. Volunteers were asked for by both groups, to go scouting out the Great Bridge of Myrddin. They would be on the move soon. Dorothea would have liked more time to let this new thing congeal, grow, become more stable, but the bridge had to be taken. She had ideas for how to do that, of course. She was the Storm Song, she had tricks and tricks up her expansive sleeves. Even a plan to just ignore the bridge and make their own ramshackle version with draconic help, if it came to that, though she would prefer not to use so many resources and so much time. Still, she worried. She didn't know what incompetence had stricken Lawrence here at Gronder, but she feared that it might have been down to his officers and not himself, and that he would display his more usual skill and talent while defending the bridge. So volunteers were asked for, and 2 answered, who would miss the feast and scout out the Great Bridge of Myrddin. That afternoon, the 2 volunteers, a purple-haired archer of Adrestia and a red-headed knight of Faergus, alongside some of their soldiers, set out, to reach the bridge late in the next day. The next day, they were riding along in comfortable silence when the Faergi decided to break it. "So do you still write?" Sylvain asked. Bernadetta startled. "Oh my goddess in Byleth, you remember that?" she asked. He nodded. "Yep," he said, laughing. "Hell, I still have the manuscript. I kept meaning to give it back to you. I've been annotating it, but then, well, you know. It's actually in my bag at camp, been keeping it like a combination of a memorial and a good luck charm." He shrugged, a bit embarrassed at the admittance, then laughed. "I mean, I guess it worked, considering I'm still alive. When those stories started to circulate, it also gave me a great conversation piece." "Stories?" Bernie asked. He nodded, as they rode amidst their soldiers. This area, so near the great Ermid River, mightiest of Fodlan's waters, was strange, almost ghostly. There was thinner forest here, newer growth, but they constantly passed empty homes and houses, which was slowing their movement considerably, having to check each of them as they passed for fear of ambush. This area was once heavily populated as trade flowed into both nations from the other, either across the bridge or carried by small boats, but the war had cleared it out, the lucky running to other places, the unlucky dying in mass slaughters. The Federation duo who were missing the feast had already found a few people in some of the empty houses, less Easter troops who'd been hiding, most surrendered, though one group had decided to fight back, a decision that had lasted up until Sylvain set the house on fire with a casually tossed fireball. They'd surrendered after that. Fire was a bad way to die. The prisoners they'd gathered, which was considerable for a mission that was technically just scouting, were in a wagon Bernie had brought along for the purpose. She was a Black Eagle, she was always prepared. That, and Dorothea had figured there'd be stragglers from the less Easter forces in the area. Good old Dorothea, 5 years of practice made her one hell of a strategist. As they stopped so the troops could check yet another empty house, this one attached to a watermill, Sylvain responded. "Yeah," the redhead said. "About the eagles." "About, fearless bear, I think they call you." Bernie shyly looked away. "I mean, yeah." Sylvain gave her a self-aware smirk, and then said something Bernie would never have associated with the boy she remembered. "If I'm making you uncomfortable, I'll stop talking," he said. "I apologize, if I've overstepped." Sylvain didn't apologize to women, but it had been 5 years. People grew up, it seemed, and not just among the eagles. "It's okay," she said. I'm nervous around people, still, except the eagles. But even with them. Talking makes me feel awkward. I prefer fighting." He nodded, and whatever he was going to say was lost as a horse, with rider, tore out of the back of the watermill from some entrance they couldn't see, turning as it left the building past the guards and going straight at them, a panicked face over a faded yellow breastplate of less Easter. Sylvain's hand was going for his lance on reflex at the sound and noise of the rider's sudden appearance, but even as his fingers closed on it an arrow whipped past his head, so close it brushed his hair. The arrow sank directly into the horse's forehead, killing it instantly and sending its twitching body sprawling in the dirt, flinging the less Easter soldier sprawling face down onto the ground in rather comical fashion. "Next arrow goes into your head," said a firm, commanding voice next to Sylvain, and it took him a solid second to realize it was Bernie's voice. What the hell? She had an arrow out and drawn, too, already aimed. It was no idle threat. "Surrender." "I surrender," the less Easter woman said, voice muffled with her face head down in the dirt. "Goddess teeth, don't kill me." "Keep cooperating and I won't," Bernie said, before turning her head to her troops, keeping her bow drawn on the enemy soldier. "Tie her up and toss her in the wagon." The matter was done quickly and efficiently, the soldier having no interest in resisting. She'd just been trying to make a break for it, and in all honesty had never even noticed the 2 people in front of her in her panic. Sylvain stared at Bernie for the entire process, trying to reconcile what he was seeing with his own memories, and the archer finally noticed once all was done. "Why what?" she asked defensively, and Sylvain shook his head, laughing. "Nothing," he said, thinking of the stories he'd heard, of a warrior on horseback who feared nothing, who acted quickly and decisively in the heat of battle. He had a story about that same woman to add to the pile, now. "Nothing," he said again, just grinning, and they rode in comfortable silence once more. That silence continued as they traveled, having no other surprises in empty buildings, finally reaching the bridge some hours behind schedule. They had taken a long way around, deliberately, having found no patrols, no guards, no anything that they should have found, the scouting party growing more paranoid by the silent second. The Feyrgi, who had fought Lawrence multiple times, had it the worst. Bernie had only grappled Lawrence once or twice. She didn't know how smart he was. He was far smarter than he'd acted at Gronder, far more dangerous, and Sylvain wondered if there'd been a plan on the field. Maybe Lawrence had been getting rid of some of his dumber or more savage subordinates, knowing the bridge would crush any opposition that chased after him despite his reduced numbers, or maybe some internal power play was going on in the alliance. Those had mostly quieted down once Ceros came to be in charge, but a few of the old rivalries flared from time to time. Eventually, some distance from the bridge, Sylvain spoke to Bernie. "I'll go see the bridge, personally," he said. "Got a spyglass, I'll take a peek." "I'll go with you," she said quickly. She did not relish the awkward sitting around and waiting for reports that inevitably came with staying back at base. It was one reason she was out scouting so often, and the very reason she'd volunteered for this job. The feast they were having sounded like a nightmare to her. This was way easier. "Be my guest," Sylvain said. He wouldn't lie, having one of the legendary eagles beside him, especially one whose prowess he'd just witnessed, made him feel easier. All this silence was spooky. They should have at least heard the low hubbub that marked large inhabited areas by now. Out they went, riding a short distance before tying up the horses and proceeding on foot. Still silence, until they found a ridge near the road right before the bridge proper, climbed it, and saw a vision straight out of hell. Bodies. Bodies and bodies and bodies. Piled not high but wide, a long, long field of bodies, starting before the bridge and crossing it to touch less easter on the other side, the corpses small at this distance but still obvious. Humans and horses and pegasi and wyverns, all laying together, all one in front of the only truly equal force in the world, an entire field of reaped souls. They were both silent for a long moment as they looked at the bodies, Sylvain finally remembering his spyglass and bringing it up to his eyes. I don't see any wounds," he said. "Or at least, not on all the bodies. But there's a lot of people grabbing at their throats." "Choked?" Bernie suggested. She'd seen it often enough. Necks were a good place to put arrows, not a lot of people thought to armor up there. But this many, they had to have died all at once. Nobody would approach that, not after seeing so much death. "No," Sylvain said. "A spell." "Maybe," she said, frowning. "Never heard of a spell that could cover such a big area, but I suppose anything's possible. I'm going in closer. Warn me if anyone approaches." "Holy shit, really?" Sylvain said, but she was already going in, crawling down the hill, quick and quiet. Fearless bear, he thought again, no wonder that first adjective was there. She was just going in, walking up to the bodies. Sylvain found it hard to take his eyes off her to keep watch, mostly out of sheer disbelief at her ballsiness. Nothing approached as she reached the closest dead man, a mustachioed fellow and his horse, one hand on the reins as the other was on his throat. She was checking the body, put a gloved finger on it before rubbing it against her thumb. "Poison," she called back to him. "I think. There's a kind of sticky film on them. Dried. If it's on them," Sylvain thought, and he glanced up with his spyglass. There, at the top of the bridge, looked rather like pipes, didn't they? "I'm coming to join you," he yelled down, crawling down after her. They really should go get their troops, but this was too strange, too interesting to leave at the moment. As he reached her, he said, "I see pipes at the bridge's top. If it's poison on their skin, then it might have been sprayed on them. It'd explain why everyone seems to be dead. If it was ingested poison, well, you wouldn't be able to touch it for one, but you'd never get this many people at a go." Bernie nodded, withdrawing 2 flasks from her belt. "Linhard made these," she said. "Kind of a super antidote, works on most stuff. Not everything, but hey, it might help. Drink it and I'll drink mine and we'll keep exploring." Down it went, tasted, kind of like watermelon, which was weird. He handed her bottle back to her, and then the duo set off, stepping over the bodies, feeling like the last 2 survivors in Fodlan before this apocalyptic scene. "Poison," Bernie said softly as they walked, taking care not to step on bodies. "From the pipes. I wonder if Claude's behind this." He was a big fan of poison, Sylvain said, as he looked into the open eyes of a dead knight. "Maybe he had a trick up his sleeve to kill us with. We take the bridge and bam. Poison kills all of us. But you know, mechanical stuff, it's tricky. I wonder if we just got lucky, if maybe his poison stunt backfired on him." "I would love to have that lucky of a break," Bernie answered, barely avoiding tripping over a dead wyvern's outstretched wing. "Between that and Gronder going so well, we might win this war yet." Sylvain chuckled as they reached the bridge's middle, finding a squat command center that, by the array of corpses before it and their positions, looked to have been besieged in its last moments. "I'll check it out," he said. Fearless bear that she was, he was still a knight of Faergus, he'd go in first this time. "Cover me." "Okay," she answered, bow out and drawn in the same breath, Sylvain inching forward past several dead wyverns and other bodies as he headed to the command post. Inside, he smelled ashes, fire, dead wyverns and a burned desk before him, nothing to his left, and to his right. His jaw actually dropped. He'd never had that happen before, but now it did. His mouth fell open for a long moment before he recovered. Bernie," Sylvain called behind himself when he could talk again, staring at a sight he could not be seeing, but his stubborn eyes kept singing the same song to his brain, so he had to believe it. "I think you need to come see this." There, sitting against the pale white wall, looking at peace for a corpse, was Lawrence Hellman Gloucester, one of the Golden Deer, direct servants of Ceros. Lawrence, who had been the best of the Golden Deer, almost honorable, who had somehow matured from the arrogant fop he'd been to the one servant of the Alliance who would honor any deal he made. The dead man's hands were stained with blood and ash, but the way he was sitting felt almost posed, prepared, somehow, so that he would be found like this. And painted on the wall behind him in red and black, his body sitting so that they appeared to be emanating from his shoulders, were the great spread wings of a black eagle, drawn in the ash and blood on his hands. "Motherfucker," Sylvain said with all the reverence of a prayer, as his mind raced to explain what he was seeing, and came to conclusions that seemed unbelievable. Bernie arrived, looked gasped, slack-jawed, same as he had been. "No," she said, no, Dorothea has spies everywhere, but it can't be, she never breathed a word that we might have had a deer." "But that doesn't make any sense," Sylvain said, even as his mind, always sharp, began to make it make sense. Lawrence, always the best of the deer, his family traditional enemies of the Regans that Claude belonged to. Lawrence, who even the kingdom, whom he fought the most, considered a man of honor. Lawrence, who had been so incompetent at Gronder, when his skill was well known. Felix. Felix never could figure out what he was sending out, Sylvain said. Most people wouldn't know of any of Felix's work as Dimitri's spymaster, but Sylvain was his lover, and now that meant he had an idea of what was going on. "Our best spies never could figure out what he was doing, what he was sending. He was communicating with us," Bernie breathed. "Oh, goddess in Byleth, holy shit, Sylvain, Lawrence was working for us." "Dorothea didn't tell you?" Sylvain said. Bernie shook her head. "No, she's always been good at keeping secrets, I just..." Sylvain. Holy shit. She was shaking his shoulder, so stunned she had to share her nervous energy somehow. Mid-shake, Sylvain noticed something in the dead man's hands. "Hey, he's something here," he said, reaching down with one hand and plucking it delicately from his grip, a thing that turned out to be a logbook, on which was written 3 sentences in a single drawing. The Faergi and the Adrestian read the last words of a Les Easterman together. Les Easter resists. Ceros fears eagles, she should fear the deer. We are on your side, Edelgard. And beneath, a crown of antlers in Adrestian reds and blacks. "Son of a bitch," Sylvain said. "Not just one deer dash." "No," Bernie said, "that doesn't make any sense dash." "No, you know what?" Sylvain said. "I don't know anything now," Bernadetta replied, and Sylvain would have laughed except he felt the same way. "But, what?" "This is above my pay grade," Sylvain said. "Let's do what we were supposed to, let's report back what we've scouted out." They raced back to Gronder, pausing only once for short sleep that night, minds still abuzz with this thing that could not be. And at Claude's side in the locket, hidden in his shadow, the ghost of a good man smiled, knowing his message had been received. Chapter 13, Shadows of the Past. Hubert's tent wasn't quite where Byleth expected to practice dark magic, but she'd learned one thing in her short stay with the Black Eagles: they were masters of making do. "Now, keep in mind that this is an initial exercise, meant to be exploratory," Hubert said, the archly sinister man indicating a mat he'd spread on his tent floor. "You are more getting a feel for your shadow than you are doing anything in particular with it. You must first know yourself to avoid getting lost in the dark. This is the step the majority of would-be practitioners of the elder magic fail. They do not learn themselves, and therefore, when they get lost, have no way to know when they've made it back home or how to tell that where they are is not their home. Many are the attempted dark mages whose souls were trapped in objects or animals, until time, or the destruction of their accidentally stolen vessel set them free. Byleth, the teacher who was now a student, stepped over and sat down on the map in her usual manner, just a position she found comfortable, Hubert had said. There wasn't precisely a pose that helped with this kind of thing, or, more accurately, there was, but Byleth wouldn't know which one suited her until she'd learned more of the dark arts. This was essentially a first blush with the midnight inside her, not an extended exploration. This was how they'd figure out all the rest of it. Small steps, so she wouldn't lose herself. Byleth wasn't sure she could stand the small steps approach, even as she saw the sense of it. She felt impatient, which was a damnably odd feeling for the stoic, calm woman. Uncomfortable, like black pepper in her lungs, a kind of feverish itching in her skin. She wanted to learn, to get it all at once, to figure out how to do the shadow work now so that she didn't need to delay her goals. Who could blame her? She wanted to see the people she'd lost. She wanted to see her father, and she wanted to see Suthies. Her father, memories sharp and clear, even as she sat and waited for Hubert to make ready. Her father, teaching her to fish. Her father, teaching her sword play. Her father, loving her, despite how odd she was, never once holding her strange heart against her. And Suthies, who had been her best friend. Her own little imaginary friend, a childhood affection she found only in adulthood, who had been terribly real, who had even turned back time, all just because Byleth asked it of her. Her students lived because of Suthies, and she would never, ever, be able to repay that debt. But sometimes, she dreamed of crying, of Suthi's voice, and thought that she might be able to pay her back. She might be able to soothe the deep grief she felt sometimes, comfort her friend and ease some of whatever titanic burden haunted the dreams of dead gods. Hubert finally brought a small, stoppered glass vial over, full of something dark and smooth and, when he handed it to her, cold, like a chunk of ice in the hand. "Drink this," he said, "and then wait. It will ease your first transition into the world of dreams and death. You won't need this as your skill grows, but for now, it'll have to do. When you sink into your shadow, focus on feeling it and it alone. Do not get distracted. There will be other shades, echoes of human lives, all around you. I rather wish we could do this in more appropriate settings, alone and away from others, but we must make do with what we have." "How will I feel it?" Byleth asked. "Your own shadow will feel like your own body," the student-turned-teacher said. "But more malleable, more fluid, and colder, and in your case, it will be gigantic. You were built by the Archbishop to contain the power of a god without crumbling to ashes. You are, and always have been, the single most powerful dark mage in all of Fodlan, maybe even the world. But your lack of training has prevented you from being able to use it in any way but unconsciously up until now, which is what I am seeking to rectify. Like the perfect metal for a sword, but still trapped within the ore, it needs a blacksmith to use it," Byleth mused. "A good metaphor," Hubert agreed. "And like that metal, you run the risk of being malformed in your making. Getting lost in the underworld is how most dark mages die, Byleth. I cannot overstate how dangerous doing that would be. Focus on yourself. Learn who you are before you begin to worry about others. Dive into your shadow self. I will do what I can to pull you back out if you get distracted, but please do not risk it." "I will not," Byleth said, even with that irritation itching inside her chest. She meant it, too. This was too important to screw up, no matter how much she wanted to see them again. She'd get there in time. They had time, before the assault on the Great Bridge, she had time. No matter how much she wanted to see them. "Here I go," she muttered, feeling nervous and unsure, new feelings, again, in her empty heart. She took the drink, which chilled going down her throat. "How long dash?" "Darkness." The transition was so quick that it cut her off mid-sentence. Almost eager, as if all this endless midnight had just been waiting for her, waiting, there all her life. Her shadow swallowed her whole, and it was good. It was right. She did not feel like a lost lamb in the deep, dark woods, she did not even feel like an owl, sailing through its native night. No, she was bigger than that, so much bigger, she contained multitudes. She was the dark the owl flew through and the shadow that hid the lamb. She was vast, massive, she felt herself stretch over this new world, this world under the world, a place where light blinded and darkness illuminated. The world around her was awash of grays and blacks, as she got up to look around, walking around in a body that formed her human shape, but she wasn't human, was she? That was easier to deal with, now. She felt, right. Homunculus. Morph. She felt, okay, now, with those words, if it meant that she was this. She felt like she'd been asleep, that it had not been the morning sun but the falling night that had finally roused her from sleep. All around her was a world of symbolism. It had the general shape of the living world, but the dreams and memories here, the living, were dim, hard to see, but she could hear them, every echo a thing of the past and the night. The voices of ghosts, all around her, so many ghosts, each around their loved ones, bright and visible and clear, fragmentary pieces of humans who had come before, all the way back to the beginning. This darkness held the human soul, and it was home. She walked through the camp, observing things she could barely understand. There, a person who could be seen, Ingrid, and she understood, then, that Ingrid had crossed the veil and come back again, could hear the echoes of a woman's will that had chosen not to die, assisted by clever hands. Whispers in the tongue of Brigid, those who had died hoping Petra could save their people. A scattering of humans around Flane, those souls who had chosen her as their friend and home after death, her soul an ocean made by the hands of an alien god, completely unlike the dark shadows of human souls, but they loved her anyway, their friend, and so they stayed, including an old woman's ghost, whose name Byleth knew, in ways she could not explain, to be Flane, to be where a saint named Sethleen had drawn her new name in these new times. And, above all of it, centered on Edelgard and her eagles. The storm. So many. So very many. A hurricane of the dead, a tower reaching up unto heaven, the gathered weight of half a continent's dead, every person who had died, thinking of the eagles, hoping against hope that they could set their nation free. They walked in the eye of the storm, in a horde that loved them, had died for them, and remained at their side, ever ready even in death. They prayed unceasingly for their success, these shadows, and pushed with whatever phantasmal weight they still had, laid their fingers as heavy on the scales of luck as they could, in hopes of tipping them just that little bit more that might let the eagles somehow win. They were here, and it was love, that kept them here. The eagles were loved, and Byleth's eyes ran over with tears in the face of that love. Was this what Hubert saw every time he threw a spell? How did he not get lost, every time? She stayed there, just swaying, absorbing that love. But in time, a spirit saw her, and stepped out of the great storm wall, her place taken by another waiting spectre. As she approached, Byleth could make out individual words, phrases, the last words of the dead, that only her ears could hear. Black eagles. For the black eagles. I die for Adrestia. I die for a free Fodlan. Fuck you, dragon. For Edelgard. In the name of the true emperor. Adrestia resists. Adrestia resists. Adrestia resists. The ghost that approached was whole, more whole than most, as if force of will had delayed decay, a person who had a reason to hang on. A woman, an Agarthan, one of the people who had become the priestly class of all Fodlan after Nemesis' great victory. A pretty woman whose hair contained some memory of its color, the blazing fire it had once held, even in this dim realm of the dead. That spirit held a hand up to her, as if to shake it, and Byleth, not knowing what else to do and trusting an instinct that said do it, for reasons she had no words to parse, took it in a warrior's grip, wrist to wrist. A memory, and more words of a dragon, of an attack that left a weakness in invincible armor. The dragon has a loose scale, the ghost, whose name Byleth now knew to be Cronia, whose whole life flashed before Byleth's eyes, said. The dragon has a loose scale. A whole life, before her eyes. A girl much given to sex and violence, rough and tumble, more than a little spoiled and selfish. A woman who nonetheless stood up for her people when the invasion came. A heroine, who freed others, who saved lives, shattered cages. There were others who lived now because Cronia had saved them, who were not the slaves of dragons because, once upon a time, this imperfect woman had been perfectly just, and perfectly brave. And Byleth, too, saw her last heroism, saw her choice to die fighting in defense of her homeland, who saw the awful death that nobility had bought her, the brutal and slow torture at the hands of Macule, that brought more tears to Byleth as usually dry eyes, tears of fear and terror and sorrow. She wept for the dead as she felt the ghost's suffering as her own. This woman had suffered horribly, and yet she had retained enough sense of self to be here, in hopes she could tell her secret at last, that she might be the last person the dragon could kill. The dragon has a loose scale, Cronia repeated, and smiled at Byleth, as the vision of that loose scale imprinted itself in her very soul. Make sure you tell them. It hasn't had time to grow back. Not yet. Byleth didn't know if that would matter, if they would have the chance, but she would tell them, yes. She would tell everyone. I'll tell them everything, Byleth swore to the ghost, as tears ran out of her eyes. She had been emotionless once, dead inside, but the armor her love of her students had chipped now cracked completely. Her contradictory spirit came alive now in the land of the dead. I'll tell them how you lived, that you died well, that you're a hero. Good, Cronia said, and smiled at her. You should do that for all of us. It'll be nice to have someone who can speak for those who have been lost. The lost, the lost. Father, Suthies. Have you seen Dash? Byleth began to ask, but even just thinking it made her leave the ground. Cronia's ghost stared at her in surprise as she was taken away, lifted up, caught in alien gravity. Byleth looked up, and saw above her the thing that had her in its grasp. It was a star made entirely out of dying ashes. The blazing standard of the sky, the fire emblem by which the world's days and nights were set, was dying, the sun gasping out its last breaths. In this realm, where darkness was sight and light obscured, she could only sense this dying sun by its absence, by the trail of ashes that rained down below. And from inside, she heard familiar weeping. Suthies, she asked. More weeping, and then a voice as big as the sea, a familiar voice, one Byleth had missed. Byleth, please. Don't leave me be. Suthies, Byleth breathed out again. Suthies. Byleth, I'm sorry, I don't have the strength. Let me fade away, let me die, here in your soul. I'm sorry. Please. I can't. Suthies, Byleth said, as her form stretched, flexed. Suthies' gravity was powerful, but this was Byleth's realm, and so she shifted, became a cloak, a shroud, wanted to wrap around the dying ember of her first friend and hold her tight. Let me help. Please. You helped me, let me help you. There is no help for this. I can help you carry your burden, Byleth offered. Share it with me, the way we have shared everything. She felt the pulse of anger from Suthies before the words hit her, a sledgehammer into the soft mass of her form. Just go away. The words were heavy, that was the only way to describe it. They were so heavy that they shot off chunks of Suthies, blazing meteors of ash. They were heavy with aching, with hurt, with tears, with things Byleth only caught sideways, just too big. They slipped out of her newly trained shadow, bright comets escaping save one, that she managed to catch, reverting to her human shape as she did so. My daughter, what have you become? Must I forgive the man who murdered me? I miss my father. That last shocked Byleth, even as the impact of the meteor into her flesh sent her flying. She held on, she saw flashes, visions, of a face she knew, a smile, a man she had last seen dying, her father, Geralt. She held on tight as that blazing comet carried her, miles and miles away from the camp, her clumsy fingers still strong enough to hang on tight. He wasn't my father, he didn't even know I was here when I knew nothing. I wish I still knew nothing. Hurt Byleth so much, didn't even know it. I hurt everyone. I'm just like my family. I want to die. Why can't I die? Byleth, please leave me alone. I want to die. The thought was too heavy to fly for long. The gravity of this place dragged it down, and Byleth went with it, going down, down, careening what felt like miles and miles, passing over a darkened fodland illuminated only by the darker shadows of ghosts. She heard, distantly, Suthi's wail of regret. Byleth. No. A roar, and a pulse of light in that dark realm, which perversely obfuscated more than darkness would, and Byleth had time to think. Of course it did. this is the land of the dead, it belongs to night, light is the stranger here. And then she hit the ground and crashed among the gathered dead of a distant land. And when she recovered herself, she rose up to see a face she knew. "Lawrence," she said, even as she let go of the drifting ash of Suthi's discarded soul. "Yes," he said, and smiled at her. "Come, and see." And she reached out again, because logic was gone. She didn't know what to do except to grasp him the way she had Kronia. This world was like a dream and she didn't know what else she could do, one thing after another after another after another. A tug and undertow Lawrence melting, becoming water, to rush her away. "Save them," he begged her, with a mouth that melted. "Save the deer." "Save the deer," she exclaimed in shock. "I'm trying to save Fodlan from the deer." And though she was so much stronger than him, her surprise let him knock her over, and she was carried away in a flood, awash with his soul. Images flashed past her, none of which made sense except in retrospect. A promise, the deer sworn to an impossible cause, the monsters who would raise up heroes. Lawrence's long nights with paid women, giving rise to children that Lawrence loved and sent away, whom he would never see again. A vision of an orange-haired woman, and a single night of passion, the woman he had loved most, a woman whom Byleth remembered only because she'd been an asshole to Byleth over her dad. And above all, the plan. The plan, the plan, the plan, and no, it couldn't be, it couldn't be. Betrayal. Byleth whispered when her head breached water, as every single thing Lawrence had ever done, the poison in the barrels, the deliberate promoting of fools, delaying the day when the fog had rolled and tore through her mind at once, alongside a million other, smaller things, done over the years to ensure that Lawrence's own nation would lose the war it had started. "Fear the deer," Lawrence said, voice all around her as she drowned in the soul stuff of him, repeating the old school joke with the solemnity of a prayer. Even now, Claude acts against heroes. "I don't understand," Byleth said, not because she didn't, but because she couldn't believe it. "You will," Lawrence said. And meek as a kitten from all this revelation, the shadow of a goddess let the lesser spirit take her miles, north and east, to the mountains, the very throat of Fodlan, to see the knife pressed to that throat. A knife with a name. "Claude," Byleth said, as the river that had once been Lawrence dried up under her, and deposited her in a room with the Duke of Dragons. The handsome Almiran man whipped his head around, surprised. "I teach," he said, confused, before shaking his head. No, I'm hearing voices. Damn, I must be tired." She saw him, but only vaguely, distantly. His shadow wasn't quite enough to cross over, not just yet, but she could see him, she could read him, she fell through his shadow into hell. Khalid, his name was Khalid, is Khalid. Visions of a pink-haired girl saving him, down in the dark, in a prison her family built, the one Goneril who might be worth a damn as a human being. Visions of a poem, dedicated to Byleth herself, that Claude was writing, that she would never see, the warm spark of his love, born the day she saved his life from an assassin's blade, the second person who had protected him without expectation of gain. It is oddly touching, to feel the torch this shadowed man has carried for the dark homunculus, despite everything. And the plan, everywhere, the plan, he willingly consigned himself to death in hopes of saving Fodlan from its sins. He planned to make a hated martyr of himself just to make sure that the Nabatea and humanity can look each other in the eye at last. Heroes will die, and Claude will be hated, and the goddess dream will be made real at last. He ached, and hurt, and bled inside, where none would ever see, save those dear he loved, and even after everything Claude had done in the service of evil, for one cannot betray what one does not first serve. Byleth's heart ached, when she saw his. But that lasted but a moment. He felt her presence, and ejected her. He was just dark enough to hide the rest of himself from her, and she was not clever enough to pry him open, not without doing it brute force, sledgehammer style, and hurting him in the process. He didn't even seem totally aware that he was doing it, an unconscious shrinking back from her, too amateur probing in his head. But some of his thoughts leaked out, and she chased them too, more shadowed currents to ride. South and west in Bear. A land soaked in the sun, tropical heat penetrating even to the underworld she swam through. In Bear, chasing a memory of a young girl bringing medicine to young Khalid, even at risk of her own life. There was a thing that should not be that she saw first, a two-headed beast that cast the shadow of a young woman with long, white hair, 2 implanted crests beating fitfully in her breast. Byleth could barely see the echo of the light that branded her so, the merest shadow of the thing that was once the daughter of a god, and now had made herself a devil. And next to the thing that should not be, was the woman that young girl who healed Khalid had grown up to be. Hilda Valentine Goneril, last of the Gonerils, Hilda, with her great axe, whose cast shadow contained light. She reached for it, unable to stop herself, curiosity killing cats and homunculi both, but as she reached out, it reached back, a hand grabbing her wrist, a hand warm and hot as the sun. "Hello, Byleth," comes a voice Byleth had not heard in 5 years. Mercedes. Chapter 14, A Light for the Future. The hand pulled all the great night of her soul into the light. She was, somewhere else. Somewhere she remembered, in those years of her father's existence, a place in eastern Leicester she had crossed, once, in those years in which she had walked through life half asleep. A forested place. Near Ordalia, if she was not wrong, the territory of Lysithea's family. They heard rumors of that place, of a 2-headed monster there, but she was still insubstantial, she was a shadow, hiding in the dappled darkness under the trees, more fey spirit than human. And the area had a grayness to it, the past? Where SHH, came the voice from nearby. She turned, and it was her Mercedes, the first student of Garag Mach to die. She was dressed in sunlight and gold and glory, and no king in all his glory had ever been arrayed like Mercedes was. She shined so bright that Byleth didn't know how she could make out her features at all the intense look she was giving her. "Where have you Byleth began, more quietly, before realizing that question wasn't the right one. She licked lips or whatever she had that passed for them, in this place. And asked a better one. "What is happening?" "A memory," Mercedes said, in low tones. "A sad memory. An important one. You need to see this." They watched. A woman ran through the woods, a beautiful woman, who had a broken bough in one hand and what looked like a book in the other. A little red notebook, which the woman held onto with a death grip, her knuckles visibly straining even at this distance. She ran, and a monster followed. Hilda, burdened by full plate, nonetheless followed her, hot on her heels. "I didn't keep all of it," Mercedes said, apologetically, as the memory began to skip back and forth. Mercedes, at the head of a small squad, Mercedes, meeting the eagles, but missing a net. Mercedes, squad decimated by Hilda's forces, Mercedes herself hurt and thrown to the ground, Hilda, ready to kill her, seeing the red notebook, and halting herself mid-axe swing, halting herself so hard she had to have torn something, axe burying itself in the dirt and not in Mercedes' skull. Mercedes, fleeing Hilda, fleeing, and hearing Hilda follow. The dream skipped, hours, minutes, seconds. 6 hours, Byleth knew, somehow. 6 hours of running, her only comfort a canteen of water that ran empty halfway in, catching only a few scattered moments of rest before she heard Hilda approaching yet again and had to run. Mercedes, wounded, unable to keep up the dance, even as she burned every last drop of adrenaline in her body, the girl who hated exercise forcing speed from her lazy bones, tossing healing magic into her veins to ease burning legs and aching sides, catching a glimpse of Hilda chugging elixirs as she ran to do the same thing. 6 hours. 6 hours of sheer terror. Then, at last, the penultimate terror, Mercedes, cornered in a glade, the spirit willing but the body simply too weak. She was up against a tree, breathing hard, weaponless save for a single last arrow, held tight in her hand, the precious notebook in the other. "Mercedes," Hilda said, in another voice Byleth had not heard in 5 years. She sounded tired, and exhausted, and angry, and sad. "You can't do this," Mercedes in memory said, and the Mercedes in death next to Byleth repeated the words. Do you know what this is?" "I do," Hilda said. She took off her helmet to reveal a face marred by sweat and a lack of cleanliness in the last 2 days, beautiful hair a ragged mess as it spilled out. "I do. I'm sorry, Mercedes. I really am. But I know what that is, and I have to have it. To give to the dragons." Mercedes asked in her tired voice. "They'll burn it, Hilda, this, think, damn it." This is bigger than Les Easter, bigger than Rhea and her dragons. I know, Hilda breathed out. Her face scrunched up, the way everyone's did before a hard cry. I know. I'm sorry, I haven't killed anyone from Gareg Mach before. I'm sorry. They'll never get it, in my hands. The dear we're not supposed to tell anyone but Mercedes, you should know. Before you die. That the dragons we're betraying them. Byleth and both Mercedes spoke as one. What? Claude Khalid, we've had this plan for years, Hilda sobbed out, the tears spilling down her face, crying as hard as a child, the undignified thing called bawling. Years, all the awful things I've done, we're monsters, but somebody has to be. Rhea was going to take the whole continent if someone didn't betray her, and we've got a plan, but you have to die. You can't escape. It's not my forces are following. They'll catch you, torture you, I can kill you quick, but they'll take you first, and I can't risk that you'll tell them about Nemesis notebook. I can hide it, give it to Edelgard when the time is right, she'll make it right, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Byleth looked at Mercedes in death, but she simply watched, transfixed, as she repeated her old words. You have to be lying, Mercedes said, slowly, as her mind turned and turned, but the lie was too absurd, too ridiculous, and in the face of Hilda's grief, Mercedes could not bring herself to disbelieve. I'm not, Hilda said. But you, please. I'm so sorry. I'll make it quick. I'll be quick. A distant sound, horns. They had been followed. Of course. Hilda's forces. Hilda looked at Mercedes with pure terror in her eyes, which did more to convince Mercedes than all her guilt. They can't find it, she said, desperation clawing her voice to shreds. If they find it, Mercedes, they can't. It's the only hope I have that this isn't all in vain, that I'm different from my family, please. Throw it to me, we can't risk it being dash. She said more, but Mercedes had not heard her, and so it was not there, the memory had not those words. What it had, instead, was the next thing Mercedes did, as Hilda babbled her sorrow. After a few long moments of thought, she threw the book to Hilda. Why? Byleth asked again, and as a stunned Hilda caught the book, Mercedes in death turned to her with something like an apologetic smile. I have always been a woman of faith, she said. And I chose to believe. Hilda, book in hand, shooting a grateful glance up to see Mercedes in memory with the arrow's edge up against her own throat. Byleth echoed Hilda's next words. What? I am a woman of fair, Gus, Mercedes said. We're famous for being willing to die for our cause, and a desperate enemy, killing themselves to deny you the pleasure. They'll believe it, won't they? It'll keep them from suspecting you of anything. Oh God, Hilda sobbed again, as she clutched the notebook tight. Yes, but dash. Then I give my life to the goddess, Mercedes said, and slit her own throat. And something in Byleth pulsed as Hilda screamed in pure horror, rushing forward to catch Mercedes as she fell, only barely remembering to keep the notebook untainted by the blood that spilled forth. Mercedes, dying. Lighting a fire. The last moment of the memory was Byleth waking up at Gareg Mach, awakened by the freely given sacrifice of a human soul. You're why I woke up, Byleth said, and Mercedes nodded. You should have slept for long years, Mercedes said. A homunculus does not recover as swiftly as a Nabatean. I had not meant for it to happen, but here we are. You are awake, as is Suthies. What? I have so many questions. Mercedes giggled, recovered from seeing her ending. I have too many answers, she said. And you are going to wake up soon. But let me show you some of what I saw. She smiled, and her smile grew and grew and grew until, like the dawn, it broke over all the world, and Byleth was sent spiraling back to her body, awash in a river of memories. A place of metal, marked with a name. Shambhala. Cold tubes of glass, containing corpses all but one. Containment failures in all but one capsule. A man in the last capsule, still alive, frozen in time, a man with a green band on his arm, the sea green of Flane's hair, a man Byleth has seen in the stained glass of churches. Ready to initiate transfer process upon password entry. A red notebook, left before that man, in a protected case. Pages. Pages and pages. She reads them through Mercedes' eyes. I have no idea what to do. Ceros is a monster too, her grief has warped into sadism, and Thales still lives, Agartha warring with everyone. I told my elites to run. They won't. I don't know why. I am unworthy to live, much less to lead. The people here seem to have gripped onto me as the man who can liberate them from Agartha. People come pouring to this small town in hopes of finding freedom here, safe in the shadow of my strength. Why? Why trust me, of all people? I have no idea how to build, how to create. I have only ever destroyed, all my life. The only task I have ever put my hands to is the work of evil. I have justified it to myself in 100 ways, but at day's end, I look back on my life, and all I see are monstrous acts, culminating in Xanadu and her face. She was awake when I killed her. Not asleep. Awake. Awake, and she knew why I was there. The instant she saw me, she put it together. With a wave of her hand, she could have unmade me, but she was so betrayed that she just let me do it. She let me strike her down, because she had chosen humanity and we had betrayed her. She had fought and argued with her own created children and her favorite daughter and, in the end, chosen us, and this was what we did with it. We killed her, so we could make weapons out of her corpse. Humanity failed Suthes. We failed our goddess. I failed her. Why did she let me kill her? She was awake. In that last moment, she could have stopped me. Did she? Did she think I would make a better choice? Did I fail her twice, once in killing her, but before then, in rejecting whatever that last moment was? She seemed so sad. What damnation is this, that in the moment I strike her down, I find faith in her? I had never cared for the goddess from the foreign star before, but now that she is dead, I keep reading the holy texts she wrote, over and over again, looking for atonement in them, atonement I cannot have, forgiveness that cannot come from her dead lips. But I find a thread in all these writings, a thought, an ideal, a dream. A better future. Humanity and Nabatean together, as people, as one. A fool's errand. I am the ultimate proof that we are not worthy of this. But Suthes believed we were better than this. That humanity was better than me. I cannot make up for my crimes, but I can ensure her dream lives. A better future. I am so sorry, Suthes. I will bring your dream to life as I brought you to your death. No more for love of gold or power will I fight, but now and forever only for a better future. I swear this to you. The author had underlined that part, and that page alone had creases, as though a man's rough hands had, once upon a time, turned back often to that promise in times of trouble, to comfort himself. Other pages. We had them all, Ceros and Sikal and Makul and all the rest. I could have avenged Sethline and all the dead of these last years, but looking at her, I could not help but see Suthes on her face, and there are so few dragons left. I let them go. I let them leave, to do what they had planned to do in the first place, before my crime, what they meant to do all along: take flight and find a new homeland, never to return again. Banishment, which is insufficient punishment for their sins, but it does give them room to redeem themselves, and I, who started all this, who murdered a goddess for payment in gold and power, and now stand acclaimed as the king of liberation, have no room to judge anyone. I cannot deny redemption to anyone, if my unworthy heart is to be granted it by popular acclaim, though I know in my very bones that I am not redeemed for my sin, that there is no redemption, for one like me. Even the least being on the planet stands my moral superior. Even Ceros, for all she has done, has a right to judge me, for the horrors she has inflicted on the world exist only because I took her mother from it. I am being a fool, but I could not do it. Having murdered the mother in cold blood, I could not slay the daughter. Forgive me, if she should come back a monster. Pray, that she finds peace out there, that the Ceros of the future is no monster but merely a person, and that she grieves her mother and is at peace at last. Still, fool that I am a wise fool. I am prepared, just in case Ceros should come roaring back to Fodlan, vengeance in her eyes. There is a place, location detailed below, that I have preserved, wherein I have kept every book I could find, every great machine thing of Agartha or Nabatea, alongside a few pieces of old technology that will let the rest stand the test of time. I leave this one last hope, the works I could gather, all the things Ceros failed to burn, in one place. They are too advanced for the society we have now. It will take time to build human and dragon society back up to a level where these books will be useful, not books of beginnings, but books of the far edge, books detailing wonders and miracles, things that were incredible even in my time. Goals to reach for, like shining stars in the night sky, a measuring stick, to see how far one has come, and how far one has to go still. In time, you will understand them. You will need someone to read them, and I have prepared for that as well. The books will be sealed up, as will those who can read them, translate their knowledge to the future, when all peoples have rebuilt and can understand them again. And there will be warriors there as well, so that, if mistake I am making, you will have fighters in hand to correct it. Dig up my grave under the old tree. Vestra will ensure that the key is there. Take the key, and utter in the place that key opens a word. That word is what I want, more than anything, and if you have read this book, you will know what I desire. I write it in code below, but you should be able to figure it out simply enough. I am sorry. If you must use this knowledge, use it with my blessing, and fix the world I ruined. And Byleth woke up in her tent, in the real world, and the last thing she heard was Mercedes' triumphant laugh, the woman who had carried her secret message across the impossible distance between life and death, the woman whose sacrifice had awoken her God. And that God, stunned, read Nemesis words through Byleth's eyes, and did not know what to feel. Chapter 15, In the Face of the Impossible. Her name is Suthes, and she wishes she were dead. She is, not, she thinks. She's not sure what she is, honestly. She had died, that much she knew for fact. God that she was capable of dying, her family had done it often enough, mostly at each other's hands, the backstabbing and politicking and casual cruelty that had marked all those who shared blood with her, that had ensured her species had a kind of cannibalistic bent to it. Her mother had gleefully remarked on the murder of brothers and not a few of her own children, combined boast and threat when made to her daughter, proof of dominating strength. Suthes herself had been spared the cycle only because she had learned how to fight, and fight well, and after the first 2 cousins that attacked her died swiftly, the rest left her be. She had cried and cried and cried, in private, had let no one know the horror she'd felt inside when her mother congratulated her on her prowess in kinslaying. Suthes had been too powerful to attack casually, and unimportant enough not to be worth attacking in the first place. She had been spared by her talent for violence and her unwillingness to play the Game of Thrones. Her mother had repeatedly tried to trick her into fighting others, but she had refused to battle anyone who did not come to fight her themselves, and eventually her mother had discarded her as a useless tool, too tough to break, discarding her among Suthes' own small holdings. Her mother had died at the hands of her own mother later, in a coup. That was how the lives of gods went. Sometimes, though, her family died at mortal hands, to uprisings and rebellions, when the atrocities reached such a peak that death by attempted deicide was seen as preferable to continued life under their reign. Many methods did mortals try, praying to other gods, finding that strength in themselves, stealing it from the draconic aliens, anything to even the odds, and even with such desperate methods, most attempts failed, but a rare few, cut to the heart of the matter, and took the head of a god. The family mocked those who died as weaklings, but Suthes had noticed they never went to those worlds again. They would claim those worlds were unfit to be ruled, but Suthes suspected that their words were merely an attempt to disguise cowardice as arrogance and pragmatism. There was a kind of nature to worlds that killed a god. Some events echoed down history, and for her own part, Suthes thought that a world that killed a god once would find the path a bit easier the second time. How ironic, that Suthes herself had died in such a manner. She had died at mortal hands, though she had committed no atrocities she could think of to justify it. She had just been telling Shamhala what could and could not be done, laid out laws, rules not that many. She'd always been cautious, maybe overly so. She hadn't wanted to be a tyrant, she'd wanted to help. She knew how some of these lines of research ended. She was trying to spare them the horror, and she always explained herself. She never said do this, not that, because I say so. She explained it to them. She had just wanted to be loved. She just wanted to be loved. It was why she had spent her early years in her newly adopted world healing it, healing anyone who asked and fixing everything and asking only that she be loved, and later, when she made her children, that they be loved in turn. She had not demanded slaves or tribute or anything at all but to spoken of kindly, to please love me. That was it. Even her reign had been more that of an advisor, hoping to help, hoping to help, hoping to help. They'd built temples to her anyway, not grand cathedrals, but little shrines, and left her gifts, and she'd been loved. They had healed her in turn, had started to stitch up a wound older than their species inside Suthi's soul, every act of devotion and kindness needle and thread for that surgery. She had died, because love was too much for her to ask for, and so they had killed her for daring to hope for it. She had died, and yet she lingered. Why? Death should have been the end of it. Nemesis had plunged the sword through her chest and broken the crest stone her species used for hearts, a sure way to die. Suthis had murdered her cousins that way too, when they would not stop, when they would not listen to her frantic pleas for them to flee, instead pressing the attack. A broken crest stone was the death of a god. But her stone, broken, still worked, somehow. She could feel it, still, shattered, parts gone, but, filled, repaired. There was something there that hadn't been, before, and Suthis had the bizarre conviction that if she could somehow hold her own crest stone up to her ear like a seashell, she would hear not the ocean, but answers. Something Solon had done. But what was it? How had this worked? Had the human faith done it to her, somehow? But that didn't make sense. Her species did not feed on faith. They often demanded it, because it was funny, because to be worshipped was their prerogative as a race of alien gods, but it gave them no charge save the emotional kind. Suthis herself had only accepted the worship because it filled that great and deep need in her, that need to be loved. But, somehow that felt right, still, that somehow their faith had changed her, somehow. It didn't matter. Suthis wanted to die. She wanted to die. She was dying, or at least, she was trying to die, to bleed out in Byleth's chest and force on her sister/host all her power and all her choices and all her bad decisions, make her to bear the burden, because that was all Suthis had ever done since Byleth's making, hurt, and burden her host/sister. Her fears and terrors from her awful childhood, even forgotten, had inspired Byleth's stoicism and infected her. All these years, Suthis hurt and hurt and hurt Byleth, and she would do it again. She would say sorry, beg for forgiveness, but what apology could cover all this? She wished she could see her father, one last time. Geralt, Captain Geralt, who had raised 2 little girls, because Suthis had known nothing of herself for years as she slept in Byleth, except a vague sense of anxiety and pain, Geralt, who had somehow healed her heart without even knowing he held it in his hands. But that wasn't, no, she had no right to it, he hadn't even known she was there. Geralt was not her father and Byleth was not her sister and Suthis was all alone in a world where her daughter was a monster and all her children were at war with one another. She had already wounded Byleth without meaning to, flung her to far distant shadows, she hadn't meant to, she always does this, she hurts her sister. The best thing she could do would be to die, so Suthis tried to die, bleeding herself by inches. But that thought, nibbling away, that she wanted to see her father again, lingering in her brain like a shadow. Underscore 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 on. When were you going to tell us you had a deer in our ranks? Bernie's bewildered question took everyone at the war table by surprise, especially the woman it was addressed to. Bernadetta, Dorothea began, shaking her head. I have no idea what you're talking about. Lawrence. Bernadetta said to the former songstress and current rebel general, as though that explained a damn thing. Bernadetta, I still don't know what you're talking about, Dorothea said. Bernadetta was quiet for a confused moment in response, which Dorothea was rather grateful for. Of all the things she had expected to hear this morning, that hadn't really been on the list, even with how surprising the morning had already been. After all, she'd expected Bernadetta and Sylvain to be back tomorrow, or the day after, having spent time scouting the bridge's defenses, but they were back not just today, but arrived early in the morning. Both had come back, Sylvain and Bernadetta both going to their separate commanders on arrival to camp to ask for meetings. Dorothea knew this because she had people watching the Faerghus camp. The Eagles had only survived this long due to information, to having the most and using it the best, and she wasn't going to abandon those habits anytime soon, even with allies. You never knew who might secretly be a traitor to Faerghus looking to stir up some shit. They'd already spotted a few people acting suspicious, whom she'd reported to Felix. She trusted the lions, but she didn't really trust their underlings. Of the three, two turned out to actually be spies for the Alliance, the third was just a guy with bad luck having a weird day. Given how urgently Bernadetta had pushed for a meeting, Dorothea had immediately called the Eagles in as well, which had seemed to surprise the archer. Only Hubert and Byleth were not here, because they were practicing dark magic and couldn't be disturbed at the moment. Raphael would make sure they were filled in later. Given how much might hang on Byleth reconnecting with Suthies inside her, Dorothea felt it more important that she keep up her studies than interrupt them for anything short of an attack on the camp. So now they were all gathered in the war tent, the most trusted guards outside while they all circled the table. Everyone shared Dorothea's look of confusion except Bernadetta, who seemed a bit bug-eyed. Actually, she clearly hadn't had much sleep last night. "You don't know," Bernadetta said finally, less question and more statement. "No," Dorothea said. "Well, fuck," Bernadetta said, which was just strange to hear. Even after her transformation into Fearless Bear, Bernadetta still hadn't been much for swearing. Dorothea's childhood had been god-awful, but at least she didn't find warfare therapeutic, the way Bernadetta had, a truth that was so foul that no song could spin it sweet enough for the stage. "Perhaps, you should tell us what you found," Edelgard offered from Dorothea's left, which was almost as strange to hear. Edelgard hadn't really contributed anything to these war councils for years, to the point that Dorothea being the real leader was the one secret the Eagles officers had that everybody in the ranks knew. Edelgard had been their greatest warrior on the battlefield, supernaturally enhanced death on legs, but she'd never really contributed leadership, not since Gareg Mach fell. But now she was back. "My love is alive," Dorothea thought with a warm thrill in her chest slash. Maybe all those songs of fantasy Dorothea had sung upon the stage had just a little truth in them, for this was the story of her life. Once upon a time, a crown prince had loved a common-born girl. "Okay," Bernadetta replied to Edelgard, a bit breathlessly. "Lawrence." Lawrence left a message. "We found his body, sitting there, and behind him were the spread wings of a black eagle. He had drawn it in ash and blood, not his own. There'd been a fight. Dead wyverns looked like Seetha's unit. A fight, and the lever inside a device. We think it was connected to the pipes that killed everybody at the bridge." "Everyone at the bridge is dead?" Dorothea asked in surprise, and Bernie let out a barking laugh. "Fuck, I didn't even start with that," the archer said, then took another breath. "Sorry, I just, so much." "Take your time, Bernie," Flane said, the old veteran giving her a soft smile from her place next to her. "Take a moment to organize your thoughts." "Yes, please, it is distressing to see you this way," Petra added worriedly from Edelgard's left, her Fodlan perfect and flawless after 5 long years. A shame, in a way. Dorothea had always found her accent and odd word choices kind of cute. She'd even flirted with her back in the day, back before Edelgard had grabbed all her attention, fascinating her with the kindness and dorkiness that lay beneath the imperial facade. "I hope Edelgard doesn't remember that," a small part of Dorothea thought with amusement, even as the greater part of her was pondering Bernadetta's words. She had the time. Bernie was taking the advice, and giving herself a moment to catch her breath. Be awkward given that Petra's basically her sister, of course, by that standard, she sort of treats Flane the same way. Quite a family structure. "We approached the bridge, encountering only a few scattered Alliance soldiers who'd fallen behind during the retreat for one reason or another," Bernadetta eventually said, in the tone she'd used for reporting to Dorothea for 5 years. She was one of the ones Dorothea relied on most to know what was going on, because only the bravest were scouts, and none in the Eagles were braver than Bernie. The bear part of her nickname was there due to Adodan's mispronunciation of her name, but the fearless she had earned fair and square. "We took them prisoner, as I didn't want them running to the bridge to announce that we were present and thought they might have information for later. We realized that everyone on it was dead. There was a sticky film on the bodies. We think it was poison that killed them, and the film was the dried poison. I've brought some back in bottles for Lindhart to analyze with the healers. Given the way they were clawing at their throats, we suspect they choked to death. We saw no survivors, though given the suspected method of distribution, those on the farthest ends of the bridge might have made it. Everyone on the bridge, all the defenders? Dorothea asked, and Bernie nodded. Yes, she said. Every soldier on the Great Bridge of Murden is dead. It's completely undefended now, just covered in corpses. The animals are leaving them alone. Apparently whatever poison was used as even keeping the flies off, didn't notice that at first, but Sylvain pointed it out as we were leaving. That much death would normally be drawing scavengers in hordes. Dorothea felt her gorge rise a little. It was one thing for people to die in pitched combat, where individual skill counted for something, where one at least was fighting back, but the atrocity Bernadetta was describing horrified her, even as she was already planning on how to use it. They'd have to get there immediately, before it could be reinforced, take off and take the bridge for themselves. The rose-colored river was too hard to cross when the bridge was well defended. They had to take advantage of this little victory, this unexpected coup, no matter how grotesque it was. A brief touch at her side, Edelgard, pressing into her lightly, supporting her. Dorothea shot her a quick smile before turning back to her archer friend. Okay, Dorothea said. The method of distribution, you mentioned it. How do you think it happened? There were pipes, Bernadetta replied. All over the bridge, the top of it we think it sprayed down. Maybe a gas, maybe a liquid, not sure. But it dried on the bodies and it choked them to death, and I have never seen so many dead in one place without a single wound on them. Piles of bodies without a drop of blood. Bernie shook her head, the most muted reaction of the eagles. Linhard looked distinctly ill, and Caspar was distracting himself by putting a hand on his lover. Petra's eyes were downcast, no doubt remembering the tragedy. When it came to who had seen the most death, only Flane truly contended with Petra, even with the war taken into account. Flane herself looked sad and resigned, as though this was an old evil come back, and even Ferdinand's horror was visible through his general dourness. Only Flane, Annette, and Raphael remained as stoic as Bernadetta, the transfers to the deer all protected, whether it be by having seen worse, sheer crystallized rage, or general good demeanor, though even they frowned at the thought. You came back, are you okay? Annette asked. I mean, I guess the poison's gone if you're alright. Maybe, Bernadetta cautioned the witch knight. I took one of Lindhard's super antidotes and so did Sylvain, and we were the only two who got on the bridge. Given what we found, I felt it best to make sure no one else saw it, though I'm sure Sylvain is telling the lions the conclusions we both came to. She grimaced a bit awkwardly, and for just a second, Dorothea saw the shy girl she had been, before the horrifying violence of desperate rebellion proved itself the world's most unlikely self. We kind of assumed that Lawrence was a spy for you, Dorothea, given what we found, and okay, we had a lot of talking but we were both kind of freaked out. I made a lot of assumptions that Sylvain's sure to be sharing right now. We're probably gonna have to do damage control on that one, sorry, Dorothea. It's okay, Dorothea said, and couldn't help the smile to reassure the girl that grew on her face. She'd done that so often back at Garreg Mach, just helping shy little Bernadetta, who was so scared to leave her room, and the smile helped, because Bernie shook a little less, was more fearless bear than Bernadetta again, when she saw that smile. But, please tell us. What did you find? At the bridge's center was a kind of command center, Bernadetta said. Lawrence was inside his body, at least, and there'd been fighting there. Only dried blood on the bridge, only corpses killed by something other than poison, were all at that command center, especially at the door. There'd been a fight. But Lawrence was in there, sitting against a wall. We didn't see a mark on him, so it was the poison, but behind him, from his shoulders, he'd drawn in blood and ash the wings of a black eagle. It was unmistakable that he was the one who'd drawn it. His hands were still covered in the blood and ash, and he'd sat there against the wall so that they looked like they were coming out of his shoulders. Our wings, Dorothea. That doesn't make any sense, Dorothea said. Sylvain thought maybe he was one of your spies, Bernadetta gave for an answer to the unspoken questions Dorothea had not voiced. Said Felix couldn't figure out what he was sending secret messages, or something, thought it was to us, and I thought, shit, maybe Dorothea had an eagle, because you're really good at this and I know you really only tell Raphael everything, which is fine. You're the boss heir, sorry Edie. It's fine, the exiled emperor said, a self-conscious smirk crossing her face briefly like an old ghost. I have been, elsewhere. And Dorothea has proven that you are all more than safe in her hands. Dorothea could not help the blush on her cheeks, a second real blush, prompted by that warm regard and simple honesty. For a woman so practiced in pretend, the real thing was a bit overwhelming, and she looked away, feeling surprisingly genuine in her demure reaction. Thankfully, Raphael stepped up while she was distracted, because he was a damn good retainer. So, Lawrence was sitting there with our symbol behind him. Why? The big Les Easterman asked. He had a notebook, Bernadetta said. He died holding it, Anne. Another stutter, but this one wasn't from nervousness, no, this was a stutter of surprise, as if the little notebook she removed from a bag on her belt had bit her on touching it. Maybe it had, she certainly put it down fast enough, quickly opening it to a last page, to let them see what was written and drawn there. Dorothea's eyes scanned over the words that could not be. Les Easter resists. Ciros fears eagles, she should fear the deer. We are on your side, Edelgard. And beneath, a crown of antlers in Adrestian reds and blacks, something blasphemous and holy in two nations at once. Dead silence ruled the world as the eagles leaned over and read those words. Dorothea heard Edelgard swallow in the silence, that was how quiet it was, she heard that dry, nervous check. But no words followed, none of them could speak, only the bear among them was fearless enough to break the silence the journal had created. That's what he wrote, Bernie said, as she held it open. That's what he felt was important enough to be his last everything. This doesn't make any sense, Dorothea said, her mind a-whirling. The deer had fought for years in service of Ciros, they were the enemies of all life in Fodlan, traitors to the goddess, who served her monstrous daughter. The eagles had never seen any evidence otherwise. No, it doesn't, Petra agreed. Lawrence, I could almost believe, was secretly acting against Ciros, given how he acted in regards to Faergus. While I was trying to find all of you, I heard a lot about him, and all of it indicated a man of great personal honor and worth, a man who might put justice above personal gain. Lawrence was a good man. But the others? No. Agreed, Raphael echoed from Dorothea's right. The deer haven't exactly been going easy on us. No, Casper agreed, they've been doing their damnedest to kill all of us since this started. Maybe Lawrence felt bad about betraying the others. Ferdinand offered hesitantly. Wanted to give us a reason to spare them in his last moments? That might fit. Why did he die in the first place? Lindhart asked. You said they were all poisoned, why did that happen? Did Lawrence betray them on the bridge? Why build a weapon to poison the bridge in the first place? I can see the sense of it, Ferdinand said. If you could control which portion was poisoned, it'd make a good weapon to halt any enemy advance for a time. You wouldn't want to ever poison the entire bridge at once, but if, say, you could poison the half facing your enemy, a useful way to buy time for reinforcements, or kill a great many foes while only risking a small percentage of your own forces. A way to reset any gains an enemy might make. Why the pipes on the back half, then? They had to know we'd only attack from one direction, Annette said. Not necessarily, Dorothea answered. I was actually planning to launch simultaneous attacks on both sides at once. If we had to take the bridge, my plan was to cross the river with Nabatean aid, then coordinate with the lions so that we'd hit both ends at once. We'd slam into it from behind, while they attacked the front, and hopefully in the confusion the Les Easter forces would split their attention and be overwhelmed. We'd lose a lot of people, but less than a frontal assault would. If Lawrence, who I assume had to build it, it sits in his territory, knew we were capable of crossing the Ermid, or just suspected we could, then it makes sense to build a weapon that could hit either side of the bridge, just in case. Be a good excuse, if you were looking to betray your own nation, and needed them to help you build the weapon you would kill them with, Ferdinand said sadly, and all eyes fell on the journal again, and the words an image that could not be. Lawrence, Ferdinand's friend, as he was letting himself remember in this moment, his best friend, at Gareg Mach, back in those long ago, innocent days of school, before all this. Lawrence, who might well have died a good man, and he had no idea how to feel about that, like Ferdinand's own father, in a way, and it is ridiculous but Ferdinand almost feels betrayed. How dare these two evil men die so well, and force Ferdinand to revise his opinions of them, without even being there anymore. Bernadetta, seeing Ferdinand's obvious distress, leaned against the dour man, to let him lean on her, and he appreciated that, pressing against the smaller woman, relying on her for a moment. Could also have been an accident, Raphael pointed out. Mechanical stuff breaks sometimes, and having a big pump to spray poison all over a bridge you're walking on, doesn't strike me as maybe the safest secret weapon to have. I mean, you're gonna be on that bridge more often than the enemy is, right? Rafe is right, Dorothea said. Seems dangerous, though if anyone could do it, it'd be the deer. Nods around the table broke the general agreement. None of the deer had been easy, really. They rarely fought Lawrence, who was mostly focused on Fergus, but they'd regularly battled the rest, and it had always been trouble. Hilda was the worst and most dangerous, but it had never been easy. Though they'd never seen Leonie, not since very, very early in the war, where she'd proven herself nearly worthy of being Gerald's apprentice, and Dorothea wondered about that sometimes. What had happened? Maybe a Fergie had gotten her, somewhere along the line? Something to ask the lions. So, what does all this mean? Edelgard asked, the question on everyone's minds. They were interrupted from further discussion by a commotion outside, the sound of guards asking questions and of someone running into the tent. Everyone went for weapons as the tent flap practically exploded inward, but what entered was not an enemy, but Byleth, face frantic and wild-eyed. Eyes that had no pupils, and were pitch black. The dragon has a loose scale, she muttered as she stumbled in, grabbing at the table, only managing it on the second go. Her shadow grabbed the table, too, a thing so bizarre it took Dorothea a second to process it. Her shadow grabbed the table, too, next to her hands, was moving on its own, and it was enormous. In her two hands alone she gripped the entire table. The room grew more dim as the smokeless torches had their mage light dimmed as the rest of Byleth's shadow entered the room, almost as if it was delayed by its own gigantic size, flooding the tent's insides in night despite the early morning. The torches were very dim, and Dorothea took an involuntary step back from the table as, in the sudden and oppressive silence, everyone heard the table gently crack as frost formed in the grooves where Byleth's shadowy claws gripped it. The room's temperature dropped, cool enough that their breaths were visible in the air, but not Byleth's. The dragon has a loose scale, and the deer are betraying Ceros, she announced. What Byleth? Dorothea asked, once the moment's terror passed. What are you talking about? Mercedes told me, Byleth said. The table continued cracking and breaking, flash freezing and starting to shatter as the too sudden change in temperature wreaked havoc in the good old wood. The dead told me her name was Kronia. The dragon has a loose scale, and the deer are betraying Ceros. Hilda told her, Mercedes gave her life to make it so. Mercedes? Annette said quietly, staring at Byleth as the professor wavered where she stood. Professor, came Hubert's voice from outside, running in. The sunlight outside was drank by Byleth's shadow, but it lasted longer than the mage light did. They saw the guards outside staring in confusion and disarray, not sure they should act, or what action would be right to take. Byleth. Byleth looked up at Edelgard, and Dorothea moved protectively before her love. The professor took no notice. Nemesis is not buried under your tree, but awaits us in Shambhala, she finally said, and then passed out on the table, the shadow slipping away as she fell boneless onto the frozen wood, splitting it in half as she went. Check the description for the links to the author.